The first rule of power is simple. Never let them see you bleed. Duke Cassian Vale learned that lesson before he could even spell his own name. He learned it watching his father collapse from a stroke at 42, right there in the Grand Hall with half the peerage watching. He learned it when his mother disappeared into laudanum and silence 6 months later, her grief so loud it became a kind of death. He learned it when the vultures circled, distant cousins, ambitious lords, creditors with sharp teeth, all convinced a 12-year-old boy couldn't possibly hold an empire together. They were wrong. 20 years later, Cassian Vale doesn't just hold power. He is power, the kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't have to, the kind that walks into a room and makes grown men forget how to breathe. His domain stretches across 3 counties. His influence reaches into Parliament itself, and his fortune could buy and sell half the aristocracy twice over. Ravenhold Keep stands like a monument to that dominance. All black stone and impossible angles, perched on a cliff that seems designed to remind the world what happens when you reach too high. But here's the thing about monuments. They're beautiful, they're impressive, and they're completely, utterly cold. If you're watching this from London or Manchester or anywhere power still matters, you already know where this is going. If you're watching from across the ocean, stick around. Because what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object is about to get real interesting. Drop your city in the comments. Hit that like button. And whatever you do, don't look away. Because the fall of a man who's never fallen before? That's a sight you don't want to miss. Let me take you back to where it all started to crack. The morning began like every other morning in Ravenhold Keep, with absolute precision. Cassian woke at 5:45 without an alarm. Never needed one. His body operated on the same principle as everything else in his life. Controlled, disciplined, exact. He dressed in silence, his movements economical. Charcoal suit pressed within an inch of its life. Silver cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. Shoes polished to a mirror shined by staff he never actually saw because they knew better than to cross his path before 7. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath around him. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their voices non-existent. The rules were clear. The Duke values silence. The Duke values efficiency. The Duke does not value excuses, explanations, or anything that resembles emotional display. What the Duke valued, really, was control. He descended the main staircase exactly at 6:15, his hand barely touching the banister. The marble steps had been cleaned overnight until they gleamed. Fresh flowers, white roses, always white roses, stood in crystal vases along the corridor, but Cassian barely glanced at them. Aesthetic maintenance, nothing more. In his study, the daily briefing waited on his desk. Estate reports, investment summaries, political correspondence, a reminder about the quarterly dinner with Lord Ashbourne and his insufferable wife. Everything organized, categorized, prioritized. Cassian sat down and began working through the stack with mechanical efficiency, his fountain pen moving across the pages with barely a pause. 30 minutes later, his steward knocked. 2 sharp raps. Never 3, never 1. Come in. The door opened. Gerald Whitmore had served the Vale family for 35 years. He'd watched Cassian grow from a devastated child into this, whatever this was. He knew better than most what lay beneath that impenetrable surface, which is to say he knew almost nothing at all. Your Grace, the Eastern tenants have submitted their quarterly reports, all accounts current, no disputes. Cassian didn't look up. Irrigation repairs on the Blackwood property? Completed ahead of schedule? Under budget. Good. What else? There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant something uncomfortable was coming. The Duchess has requested your presence at breakfast. Cassian's pen stopped moving. Just for a second, then continued. I have a meeting with the solicitors at 8. She's aware, Your Grace. She asked anyway. Tell her I'll join her for dinner. She specifically requested breakfast, Your Grace. She said. Cassian looked up then. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and they carried about as much warmth. The steward's voice died mid-sentence. I said dinner. Whitmore bowed slightly. Of course, Your Grace. The door closed. Silence returned. Cassian went back to his papers like nothing had happened, because in his mind, nothing had. Leora would understand. She always understood. That was the foundation of their arrangement. Mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual distance. Marriage, in Cassian's philosophy, was a contract, a strategic alliance between two great houses. The Ashbournes had pedigree and political connections. The Vales had wealth and power. Together, they formed an unstoppable force within society. That was the point. That was always the point. Love was something other people needed. Weaker people. People who couldn't control themselves. Cassian had watched love destroy his mother, had watched her become a shell of herself, rattling around an empty estate talking to ghosts, had watched servants whisper about the Mad Duchess until even the title lost its meaning. He would not make that mistake. So he'd chosen Leora Ashbourne with the same careful deliberation he applied to everything else. She was intelligent, composed, well-educated. She understood society's rules and played the game flawlessly. She would be an asset, not a liability. A partner in maintaining the empire, not a distraction from it. And for the first year, it worked perfectly. Across the castle, in the breakfast room that overlooked the eastern gardens, Duchess Leora Vale sat alone at a table set for two. She'd been sitting there for 40 minutes. The tea had gone cold. The toast sat untouched. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a spread that would have fed 6 people but was intended for one conversation that wasn't happening. Again, Leora didn't cry. She'd learned early in this marriage that tears were a waste of salt and water. Cassian didn't respond to emotional displays, didn't even seem to register them. It was like watching someone try to make a statue feel guilty, pointless and vaguely embarrassing for everyone involved. Instead, she sat very still and stared at the empty chair across from her. She'd been Lady Leora Ashbourne once, the pride of her family. Witty and warm, her mother used to say. The kind of girl who could light up a room just by walking into it. She'd loved music and poetry and long conversations that went nowhere in particular. She'd believed in romance, in partnership, in the idea that marriage could be more than a merger of assets. Then she'd met Cassian Vale at a state dinner, and everything changed. He'd been magnificent. There was no other word for it. Tall and commanding, with a presence that made everyone else in the room seem somehow less real. When he spoke, people listened. When he moved, they made way. He'd asked her to dance with the kind of formal courtesy that felt almost antiquated, and when his hand touched hers, she'd felt something electric run through her entire body. He's different, she'd told her friends later. Reserved, yes, controlled, but underneath all that there's something extraordinary. And she'd been right. There was something extraordinary underneath Cassian's control. The problem was, she'd never actually gotten underneath it. Their courtship had been brief and proper. Chaperoned walks in designated gardens. Carefully structured conversations about literature and politics. He'd been attentive in a distant kind of way, asking intelligent questions and listening to her answers with what seemed like genuine interest. When he proposed, he did it correctly. Formal request to her father, a family heirloom ring, one knee in the drawing room with both their families watching. I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife. Not, I love you. Not, you've changed my life. Just a transaction, dressed up in pretty words. But Leora had been young enough to believe the pretty words were placeholders for feelings he simply didn't know how to express. She'd convinced herself that marriage would soften him, that intimacy and time would break through that reserve and reveal the passionate man she was certain existed underneath. 3 years later, she was still waiting. The wedding had been spectacular. 300 guests, flowers imported from 4 countries, a ceremony that got written up in every society column from London to Edinburgh. Duchess Leora Vale, they'd called her. The woman who'd captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor in England, except she hadn't captured anything. Their wedding night had been polite, efficient. Cassian had been a considerate lover in a technical sense, making sure she wasn't uncomfortable, asking in low tones if she was all right. But there'd been no passion, no desperate need, just another box to check on the list of ducal responsibilities. She'd told herself it would get better, that he was nervous, that aristocratic men were raised to be reserved about such things. It didn't get better. Their physical relationship settled into a pattern of scheduled encounters, twice a month, always late at night, always in the dark. Cassian was never rough, never demanding, but he was never there. Not really. It was like making love to a beautiful automaton that had been programmed to hit all the right notes without ever understanding the music. And everything else followed the same pattern. Breakfast alone, lunch alone, Dinner together exactly 3 times a week, where they discuss estate business and social obligations with the warmth of a board meeting. He never asked about her day, never inquired about her interests, never seemed to notice when she changed her hair or wore a new dress, or spent hours arranging flowers in the hall just hoping he'd comment. The servants pitied her. She could see it in their eyes. Poor Duchess. Married to a statue. The whispers followed her through the castle. Have you seen them together? He treats her like a piece of furniture. Beautiful furniture, but still. Leora had tried everything. She'd organized dinners, hoping shared social obligations would spark something. She'd redecorated his study with warmer colors and personal touches, trying to soften the edges of his world. She'd attempted conversations about art, philosophy, even just the weather, anything to crack through that impenetrable surface. Nothing worked. Worse than nothing. The more she tried, the further he seemed to retreat, as if her very presence was an invasion he had to defend against. The really devastating part? He wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice or criticized her or made her feel small. He was unfailingly courteous. He ensured she had everything she could possibly need: clothes, jewels, staff, unlimited funds for whatever charitable work she wanted to pursue. By every objective measure, she was living a fairy tale. She was also dying inside, very slowly, very quietly, in the most luxurious prison ever constructed. The breakfast room door opened. Leora looked up with something like hope. It was just Whitmore. Your Grace, the Duke sends his regrets. He has a prior engagement. Of course he does. The words came out flat, dead. Whitmore's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, but he was too well trained to let it show for long. Shall I have cook prepare something fresh? No, thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I'm not hungry. She stood up, the legs of her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud for the silent castle. Whitmore began clearing the untouched food, not meeting her eyes. Leora walked to the window and stared out at the gardens. They were spectacular. She'd made sure of that. Rolling green lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, flower beds that exploded with color. She'd spent months working with the groundskeepers, designing every detail, creating something beautiful in this cold stone fortress. Cassian had never once walked through them with her. For 3 years, she'd told herself he was just reserved, damaged by his childhood, incapable of expressing what he felt, but surely feeling something underneath that control. But what if she'd been wrong? What if there was nothing underneath? What if the control wasn't a mask, but the truth? And Cassian Vale simply didn't have the capacity to feel anything for her at all? At 8 o'clock precisely, Cassian sat down across from his solicitors in the formal meeting room. The contract negotiations took 2 hours. A mining operation in Wales, complicated shares structure, potential regulatory issues, significant upfront investment with long-term returns. The kind of deal that required absolute focus and strategic thinking. Cassian excelled at it. By 10 o'clock, he'd restructured the entire proposal, identified 3 major risk factors the solicitors had missed, and negotiated terms that would increase projected returns by 30%. The lawyers left looking vaguely shell-shocked, clutching folders full of notes they'd have to completely revise. Whitmore appeared the moment they'd gone. Lord Ashbourne has arrived, Your Grace. He's waiting in the drawing room. Cassian frowned. I don't have an appointment with Ashbourne. No, Your Grace. He arrived unannounced. He says it's urgent. Urgent. Cassian disliked that word. Urgent implied chaos, lack of planning, emotional decision-making, all things he'd spent his life eliminating. But Richard Ashbourne was his father-in-law, a senior member of Parliament, and generally not given to dramatics. Show him in. Lord Ashbourne entered with the bearing of a man who'd spent 50 years in positions of power. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of weathered dignity that came from being on the winning side of history. But today, there was something different in his expression. Tension. Maybe even anger. Cassian stood, extending his hand. Richard. This is unexpected. Ashbourne shook his hand, but there was no warmth in the gesture. We need to talk, Cassian. Of course. Please, sit. They settled into chairs by the fireplace. Cassian waited, his posture relaxed, but his mind already calculating possibilities. Financial trouble? Political scandal? Health crisis? How is my daughter? There it was. Cassian kept his expression neutral. Leora is well. Is she? The interruption was sharp, uncharacteristic. Cassian felt something shift in the room, some subtle change in pressure he couldn't quite identify. I'm not sure I understand, Richard. Ashbourne leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His signet ring caught the light. Don't play ignorant with me, boy. I know what's happening in this house. Boy. Cassian hadn't been called that in 20 years. He felt his jaw tighten fractionally. I assure you, everything is... My daughter writes to her mother. Did you know that? Of course. And her mother shares those letters with me. Would you like to know what they say? Cassian said nothing. Ashbourne's voice dropped lower. She's miserable, Cassian. Utterly, completely miserable. She lives in a palace and has everything money can buy. And she's dying inside because her husband treats her like a particularly attractive piece of furniture. That's not fair, isn't it? The older man's eyes flashed. When was the last time you had a real conversation with her? When did you last ask about her day, her feelings, or anything? We have dinner 3 times a week, where you discuss estate business, like she's your secretary. Cassian felt heat rising in his chest, the unfamiliar sensation of being challenged in his own home. We have a perfectly functional marriage. Leora has never complained to me about... Of course she hasn't complained to you. Ashbourne stood up, pacing toward the window. You're about as approachable as a block of ice. She's terrified that any display of emotion will make you retreat even further than you already have. I don't retreat. I maintain appropriate boundaries. Appropriate? Richard spun around. You're married to her, for God's sake. She's your wife, not a business associate. Marriage is a partnership, a contract. Marriage is a union. It's supposed to be built on affection, companionship, intimacy, all of which we have. Do you? Ashbourne's voice went very quiet. Very dangerous. Tell me, Cassian, do you love my daughter? The question hung in the air like smoke. Cassian's mind worked furiously. This was a trap. Had to be. If he said yes, Ashbourne would demand proof he clearly couldn't provide. If he said no, he'd be admitting to... What? Breach of contract? Emotional fraud? I respect Leora enormously. That's not what I asked. Love is... Cassian chose his words carefully. Love is an emotional state that clouds judgment and leads to irrational decisions. I care for Leora's well-being. I ensure she has everything she needs. I honor our commitment. That's far more valuable than any fleeting feeling. Ashbourne stared at him like he'd just spoken in ancient Greek. My God, you actually believe that. It's what I was raised to believe. It's what's kept this estate running, what's maintained our family's position for generations. And what does it cost you? Nothing. It's cost me nothing. Hasn't it? The older man moved closer. His expression had shifted from anger to something that looked almost like pity. Cassian, I watched you grow up. I remember the boy you were before your parents died. Bright, curious, full of life. And I've watched you systematically destroy every human impulse you ever had in the name of control. You think that makes you strong, but all it's done is make you hollow. The words hit harder than they should have. Cassian stood abruptly. I think this conversation has gone far enough. You're right. It has. Ashbourne walked toward the door, then paused. I came here to give you a warning, Cassian. My daughter deserves better than this. She deserves a husband who actually sees her, who values her for more than her bloodline and social connections. If you can't give her that, if you can't find it in yourself to be a real partner to her, then I'm going to advise her to leave. Leave. The word was absurd. We're married. She can't just... She can. And she should. Ashbourne's hand was on the door handle. You've built yourself an empire of stone and ice, Your Grace. But empires need people to rule over. And people need more than efficiency and control. They need warmth, connection, love. And if you can't provide that, you're going to find yourself sitting alone on a very cold throne. The door closed. Cassian stood motionless in the center of the room, his hands clenched at his sides. Ridiculous. The whole conversation was ridiculous. Ashbourne was overreacting, probably driven by his wife's emotional hysteria. Leora was fine. Their marriage was fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. So why did he feel like the floor had just shifted underneath him? Bye. That night, Cassian did something he almost never did. He went looking for his wife. She wasn't in her chambers. Wasn't in the music room, or the library, or any of the usual places. He finally found her in the East Gallery, a long corridor lined with family portraits that no one ever visited. She was standing in front of his parents' portrait. Cassian stopped in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. She hadn't heard him approach. In the dim light from the sconces, she looked almost ethereal, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, a simple dress the color of moonlight, her hand raised as if she might touch the painting. Leora. She turned, and for just a second he saw something raw in her face. Surprise. Maybe pain. Then it smoothed over into the practiced courtesy she always wore around him. Your Grace. I didn't know you were there. Your Grace. She called him Your Grace, in their own home. When had that started? I was looking for you. We have dinner scheduled. Do we? She glanced toward a window. I didn't realize it was so late. It's 7:30. Of course. She moved away from the portrait, her movements fluid and graceful. The perfect Duchess. Shall we go down? Cassian didn't move. He found himself staring at the portrait she'd been examining. His father in full ducal regalia, his mother seated beside him in an emerald gown. They looked magnificent, powerful, united, completely miserable. He'd never noticed that before. How his mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. How his father's hand on her shoulder looked more possessive than affectionate. How the space between them on that painted bench seemed to stretch for miles. Did you know them? He asked suddenly. My parents. Leora looked surprised by the question. I met your mother once, when I was very young. She was fragile. I remember thinking she seemed terribly sad. She was. The words came out before he could stop them. Leora moved closer, her expression softening. What happened to her? I've heard rumors, but my father died, and she couldn't survive it. He'd never said it out loud before, never articulated the fundamental truth of his childhood. Leora was watching him with something that looked like understanding. She loved him that much? Cassian turned away from the portrait. That's the problem with love. It makes you weak, dependent. When you build your entire existence around another person, you lose yourself. And when they're gone, you can't recover, Leora finished quietly. Exactly. They stood in silence. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed the half hour. Is that why you married me? Leora's voice was barely above a whisper. Because you knew you'd never love me enough to be destroyed by losing me? The question cut through him like a blade. I married you because you're intelligent, capable, and from a good family. Because I thought we could build something sustainable. Something that doesn't depend on unpredictable emotions or temporary feelings. Something safe. Yes, something that won't hurt you. Cassian looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw for just a moment the woman underneath the Duchess. The person who'd been standing in front of his parents' portrait, looking at a preview of her own future. Leora. I should change for dinner, she said, her voice suddenly bright and brittle. I know you prefer me to dress appropriately. She moved past him toward the door. He reached out without thinking, caught her wrist. Wait, she stopped. Didn't pull away, but didn't turn around either. Your father came to see me today. I know. He told me he was coming. He thinks I'm failing you. Are you? The question hung between them. Cassian's hand was still on her wrist. He could feel her pulse, rapid and delicate. I'm trying to give you everything you need. Leora turned then. Her eyes were dry but devastated. You're giving me everything except yourself. And I don't need jewels or gowns or unlimited funds, Cassian. I need a husband who actually wants to be in the same room with me. Who asks about my day because he genuinely cares, not because it's socially appropriate. Who touches me like I'm a person he desires, not a duty he's fulfilling. I do want... Do you? Her voice cracked. Because from where I'm standing, you want control. You want order. You want an empire that runs smoothly with no complications. And I'm just another component in that machine. A decorative piece that serves a function. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you kissed me when it wasn't leading to something else? When did you last hold my hand just to hold it? When have you ever looked at me the way other men look at their wives? Like I'm the most important thing in your world? Cassian felt something cracking inside him. Some carefully maintained wall starting to fracture. I don't know how to be what you want. The confession shocked both of them. Leora's expression softened. Oh, Cassian. She lifted her free hand to his face. The gesture was so gentle it almost hurt. I don't need you to be anything other than honest. If you can't love me, if you're genuinely incapable of it, then tell me. Let me make peace with that reality. But don't keep me in this limbo where I'm constantly hoping for something you'll never be able to give. I'm not incapable of—" The words died, because he didn't know if they were true. Leora's hand dropped. She pulled her wrist from his grip, and he let her go. "I'm going to visit my family for a few weeks," she said quietly. "I think we could both use some distance." "You're leaving?" "I'm taking a trip." "There's a difference." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow? That's—" He struggled for words, sudden, impulsive. "I've been thinking about it for months, actually. I only decided today to actually do it." She moved toward the door again. "I'll send word when I know how long I'll be gone." "Leora, we need to discuss this properly." She paused in the doorway, her back to him. "We've been discussing it for 3 years, Cassian. I've been telling you in 1,000 different ways what I need. You just haven't been listening. Maybe if I'm not here, you'll finally hear me." She left. Cassian stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who'd all mastered the art of looking powerful while being utterly, completely alone. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something that might have been fear. The next morning was chaos. Staff running through corridors, trunks being carried downstairs, the Ashbourne carriage waiting in the drive, horses stamping impatiently. Cassian watched from his study window as Leora supervised the loading of her belongings. She was wearing traveling clothes, practical, elegant, completely composed, as if this were just another social call, not the dissolution of their life together. He should go down there, should talk to her, should— what? Beg her to stay. Promise things he didn't know how to deliver. He stayed at the window. Whitmore knocked and entered without waiting for permission, something he only did in emergencies. "Your Grace, the Duchess is departing. Did you want to—" "No." The word came out harder than intended. Whitmore's expression remained carefully neutral. "Should I inform her you'll write?" Cassian turned from the window. His face was a mask. Perfect ducal composure. "Tell her to take whatever time she needs, and ensure she has adequate funds for her stay." "Of course, Your Grace." Whitmore left. Cassian returned to his desk and picked up the contract he'd been reviewing. The words blurred, meaningless. He forced himself to focus, to concentrate, to do what he'd always done, push through emotion with discipline and work. Outside, a carriage door closed, wheels on gravel, hoofbeats fading into distance. She was gone. Cassian put down his pen and stared at the empty page in front of him. The castle was perfectly silent, exactly as he'd always wanted it. He'd never felt more alone in his life. 3 days later, Cassian realized something was wrong. Not wrong in the obvious sense. The estate continued running flawlessly. His business affairs proceeded on schedule. Society hadn't collapsed. But something fundamental had shifted. The castle felt wrong. He couldn't quite articulate it. The temperature was the same. The routines were identical. The servants performed their duties with the same invisible efficiency. But there was a quality missing, some indefinable element that he hadn't noticed until it was gone. On the 4th day, he walked past the drawing room and stopped. The flowers were dying, white roses drooping in their crystal vases, petals scattered on the marble table. He stood staring at them with a strange sense of vertigo. When had Leora started arranging flowers? He couldn't remember, couldn't pinpoint a specific moment, but suddenly he realized they'd been everywhere: the entrance hall, the breakfast room, his study, the gallery. Fresh and perfect and alive. She must have been doing it herself. The servants wouldn't have taken such care, wouldn't have chosen each bloom so precisely, arranged them with such subtle artistry. He hadn't noticed. Cassian continued walking, but now he saw absences everywhere. The music room was silent. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her play piano. The library had gaps on the shelves where she must have borrowed books. The breakfast room still had 2 place settings, but one side remained perpetually empty. How long had she been eating alone? At dinner that night, he sat in his usual chair. Whitmore served him with perfect precision. The food was excellent. The wine was flawless. Cassian stared at the empty seat across from him and couldn't eat a single bite. By the end of the first week, rumors started circulating. Lord Pemberton mentioned it at the club. Heard the Duchess is visiting family. Extended stay, I understand? Cassian had deflected smoothly. Family matters. Nothing of consequence. But Pemberton's expression said he didn't believe it. And when Lady Morrison asked about Leora at the opera 2 nights later, her smile had a sharp edge that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Society was watching, waiting, wondering if the perfect Duke and Duchess Vale were quite so perfect after all. Cassian maintained his composure flawlessly, attended his meetings, managed his estates, fulfilled his social obligations. If anyone noticed he'd become even more withdrawn than usual, they were too polite or too frightened to mention it. But at night, alone in his chambers, he couldn't stop thinking about Leora's face in the gallery, the quiet devastation in her voice, the way she touched his cheek with such gentleness it had nearly broken him. "You're giving me everything except yourself." He'd been raised to believe that self-control was strength, that emotional restraint was the foundation of power. His father had drilled it into him. Never let them see weakness. Never give them leverage. Never, ever let feelings compromise your judgment. And it had worked. He'd built an empire on that philosophy, commanded respect, accumulated wealth, achieved everything his father had wanted, and more. So why did it feel like he'd lost something crucial along the way? On the 10th day, he received a letter. Not from Leora. From her mother, Lady Catherine Ashbourne. The contents were brief and devastatingly polite. "Dear Cassian, Leora has arrived safely and is in good spirits. She's asked me to inform you that she's decided to extend her visit indefinitely. She will write to you herself when she's ready to discuss next steps. I trust you understand this is a delicate time for our family. We hope you'll respect Leora's need for space and reflection. Yours truly, Catherine." Next steps. Cassian read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meaning in the careful phrasing. Indefinitely. Next steps. Delicate time. She wasn't coming back. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a temporary visit. This was a separation, possibly a prelude to something worse. He stood up abruptly, paced to the window. The garden stretched out below, magnificent and empty. All that beauty and no one to see it. All that space and no one to fill it. For the first time since his mother's death, Cassian Vale felt something that might have been panic. He tried to work, couldn't focus. Tried to read. The words slid off the page. Tried to sleep and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through conversations that had happened and conversations that never would. On the 14th day, he did something completely irrational. He went to Leora's chambers. He'd never been inside them, not once in 3 years of marriage. That was her private space, and he'd respected that boundary the way he respected all boundaries, absolutely. Now he stood in the doorway and felt like he'd stepped into another world. The room was beautiful, soft colors, cream and pale blue and touches of gold, books stacked on every surface, sheet music scattered across a small writing desk, watercolors on the walls, amateur work, but charming. Had she painted those herself? He moved deeper into the room, drawn by details he'd never known existed. A collection of pressed flowers in a journal, letters from friends, carefully saved, a half-finished embroidery project, the needles still threaded. On her vanity, a small music box. He opened it. A delicate melody filled the room, something by Chopin, melancholy and beautiful. Inside the box, a miniature portrait. Him. Cassian picked it up with shaking hands. It was from their wedding day. He looked younger in it, less guarded, almost hopeful, the kind of man who might believe in the possibility of happiness. When had that man disappeared? He set the portrait down and saw what was underneath it. A letter, half-written, the ink smudged as if she'd been crying. "My darling Cassian, I don't know if I'll ever send this. I don't know if you'd read it if I did, but I need to write it anyway, need to put into words what I can never seem to say to your face. I'm leaving. Not because I don't love you. God help me, I do, more than I ever thought possible. I'm leaving because loving you is slowly killing me." The letter ended there, unfinished, unsent. Cassian read those last lines over and over until they burned themselves into his brain. Loving you is slowly killing me. He sank into the chair by her desk, the letter clutched in his hand. What had he done? More than that, what had he failed to do? He'd given her wealth, status, security, everything he thought mattered, everything his father had taught him to value. But he'd withheld the one thing she'd actually needed: himself. Not the Duke, not the perfectly controlled, ruthlessly efficient, emotionally bankrupt version of himself he showed to the world, but the man underneath, the one who'd been terrified and alone at 12 years old, the one who'd learned that feelings were dangerous and love was fatal, the one who'd spent 20 years building walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. Leora had wanted to see him, had been trying to reach him for 3 years, and he'd shut her out so completely she'd had no choice but to leave. The music box was still playing, that sad, beautiful melody cycling over and over. Cassian closed his eyes and let himself feel it. All of it. The loneliness he'd been denying, the fear he'd been suppressing, the grief for a marriage he'd destroyed through sheer emotional cowardice. And underneath it all, something else. Something he'd been running from for so long he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. He loved her. Of course he loved her. How could he not? She was brilliant and kind, and so achingly beautiful it hurt to look at her sometimes. She'd brought light into his dark fortress, and he'd snuffed it out because he was too afraid to let it burn. He loved her, and he had lost her, and it was entirely his own fault. The realization should have broken him, should have sent him spiraling into the same kind of grief that had destroyed his mother. Instead, it clarified everything. Cassian stood up. The letter was still in his hand. He looked at those unfinished lines one more time. I'm leaving because loving you is slowly killing me. No. He wouldn't let that be the end of the story. Wouldn't let his fear and his damage destroy the one person who'd ever tried to break through his defenses. If Leora wanted him to fight for her, he would fight. Not with control or strategy or any of the tools he usually wielded, but with honesty, vulnerability, all the terrifying, dangerous emotions he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if she'd even listen, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't let her go without trying. Cassian Vale, the Duke of Ravenhold, the man who controlled everything and feared nothing, was about to do the most frightening thing he'd ever done. He was going to tell his wife the truth. The Ashbourne estate was 3 hours away by horseback. Cassian could have taken a carriage, but he needed the speed, needed the movement, needed to do something with the energy coursing through him before it consumed him entirely. He rode through the night, his horse's hooves pounding against the road, his mind racing faster than the miles disappearing behind him. What would he say? How did you apologize for 3 years of emotional absence? How did you convince someone to give you another chance when you'd systematically destroyed every reason they had to trust you? He didn't have answers, didn't have a plan. For the first time in his adult life, Cassian Vale was operating purely on instinct. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive he'd felt in 20 years. Dawn was breaking when he reached the Ashbourne gates. He didn't stop to announce himself, just rode straight up the drive toward the manor house, and found Richard Ashbourne waiting on the steps. The older man looked unsurprised, almost as if he'd been expecting this. Cassian dismounted. They stared at each other for a long moment. I need to see her. Richard's expression was unreadable. Does she want to see you? I don't know. Cassian's voice was raw from the ride and something else. But I'm not leaving until I've talked to her. You look like hell. I feel like hell. Good. Richard's face softened fractionally. That's a start. Come inside. They walked through the entrance hall. Cassian was acutely aware of how he must look. Clothes disheveled from the ride, hair windblown, probably wild-eyed. The exact opposite of the controlled Duke everyone expected. Richard stopped at the base of the main staircase. She's in the garden. East side, near the roses. And Cassian. Yes? Don't fuck this up. I won't. He said it with more confidence than he felt. Saik. Cassian found her exactly where Richard said she'd be. She was sitting on a stone bench, a book open in her lap, morning sunlight turning her hair to silk. She looked peaceful, content, more relaxed than he'd seen her in months. His arrival was going to shatter that peace. He walked toward her slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel path. She looked up at the sound, and her entire body went still. Cassian. It was barely a whisper. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. They stared at each other across the distance he'd created. The space between them felt enormous, unbridgeable. Then Leora closed her book and stood up. What are you doing here? I came to talk to you. We've talked, Cassian. Talking hasn't helped. Then I came to listen. She blinked. That was clearly not what she'd expected. I found your letter, he continued, the one you didn't send, in your chambers. You went into my chambers? Yes. Why? Because I was trying to understand. He took a step closer, trying to figure out what I'd lost. And I found it. All the pieces of you that I'd never bothered to see. The paintings, the music, the pressed flowers, all these beautiful parts of who you are that I completely ignored. Leora's eyes were shining. I tried to show you, I know, and I was too much of a coward to look. The word hung between them, coward. The one thing Cassian Vale had never allowed himself to be. You were right, he said, about everything. I gave you wealth and status, and treated you like a component in my perfectly ordered life. I withheld myself because I was terrified that feeling anything would make me weak, that loving you would destroy me the way loving my father destroyed my mother. Past tense. The word was careful, tentative. Cassian met her eyes. I was wrong. I was wrong. The words hung in the air between them like smoke after gunfire. Leora stared at him, her book still clutched against her chest, her expression unreadable. Cassian had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the ride here, had pictured her face softening, her eyes filling with hope, her arms reaching for him, had convinced himself that honesty would be enough, that the truth would fix everything. He'd been a fool. Leora's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders squared, and when she finally spoke, her voice was ice. You were wrong. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. And you come here now looking like you've ridden through hell, and you think those words fix it? You think admitting you were wrong erases everything you put me through? No. Cassian forced himself to hold her gaze. I don't think it fixes anything. I think I'm 3 years too late, and I have no right to ask for anything from you. But I needed you to know the truth anyway. The truth. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is, you married me like you'd purchase a thoroughbred horse. Good bloodlines, proper training, aesthetically pleasing. And you kept me in a stable made of marble and called it a palace. That's not, isn't it? Her voice rose. You wanted a duchess who'd look perfect at parties and produce heirs on schedule and never, ever demand anything inconvenient, like actual intimacy or emotional honesty. And I performed that role flawlessly for 3 years while dying inside, and now you're here telling me you were wrong? I'm here telling you I was terrified. The confession stopped her cold. Cassian took a breath, forced himself to continue, even though every instinct screamed at him to retreat behind the walls he'd spent 20 years building. I watched my mother destroy herself over my father, watched her become a ghost wandering empty rooms, talking to memories. She loved him so completely that when he died, she couldn't function, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't exist without him. And I was 12 years old, watching it happen, powerless to stop it. So I made myself a promise. He stepped closer. Leora didn't move. I promised myself I'd never give anyone that kind of power over me, never let myself need someone so badly that losing them would break me. And I built my entire life around that promise. Control, discipline, emotional detachment. It worked perfectly. I became exactly what my father wanted me to be, strong, untouchable, immune to weakness. And then I met you. The garden was silent except for birdsong, and the distant sound of water from a fountain. Leora's eyes were locked on his face. You terrified me, Cassian said quietly. From the first moment I saw you at that dinner, laughing at something Lord Pemberton said, your whole face lit up like sunrise. I looked at you and felt something I'd never let myself feel before. Want. Real want. Not just attraction or strategic interest, but genuine desire to know you, to be near you, to make you smile like that at me. So what did you do? Her voice was barely a whisper. I married you. And then I spent 3 years trying to keep you at a distance because I was convinced that if I let you get too close, you'd have the power to destroy me, just like my mother was destroyed. He was close enough now to see the tears gathering in her eyes, close enough to reach out and touch her if he dared. But here's what I didn't understand. You already had that power. The moment I married you, the moment I brought you into my life, you became the one person who could break me. And keeping you at arm's length didn't protect me from that. It just guaranteed that when you finally left, it would hurt exactly as much as I'd always feared. A tear spilled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. You broke my heart, Cassian. I know, Every single day for 3 years. I know. You made me feel invisible, worthless, like I was nothing more than a beautiful object you'd acquired and forgotten about. I know. His voice cracked, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. But I need you to understand, it wasn't because you weren't enough. It was because you were everything. And that scared me more than anything I'd ever faced. Leora closed her eyes. More tears fell. Cassian's hands clenched at his sides, every fiber of his being screaming at him to hold her, to fix this, to make it right. But this wasn't something he could control, couldn't strategize or negotiate or dominate into submission. This was raw human connection, messy and unpredictable and completely beyond his ability to manage. So he did the only thing he could do. He waited. Here's what most people don't understand about power. Real power isn't about domination. It's not about bending the world to your will or making everyone around you submit. That's just control. And control is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, endless vigilance, the exhausting work of keeping everything locked down tight. True power is something different entirely. It's the ability to be vulnerable and survive it, to let someone see all your damage and weakness and fear, and trust that they won't use it to destroy you. Cassian Vale had spent his entire adult life confusing control for power, had built an empire on the foundation of never letting anyone close enough to hurt him, and he'd convinced himself that made him strong. But standing in that garden, watching Leora cry because of what he'd done to her, he finally understood the difference. Strength wasn't keeping people out. It was letting the right person in, even when every survival instinct you had screamed danger. The question was whether he'd realized it too late. When Leora finally opened her eyes, her face was wet but composed. She looked at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read what she was thinking. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to listen. She nodded slowly. All right. Cassian took another breath. This was the hard part. The part where he had to strip away every last defense and show her exactly who he was underneath all that carefully constructed armor. When I found your letter, the one you didn't send, I read it over and over. Loving you is slowly killing me. That's what you wrote. And I realized that I'd been doing the same thing to myself, except I'd been killing the part of me that knew how to feel anything real. The part that wanted connection and intimacy and all the messy, complicated things I'd convinced myself were weaknesses. He moved closer, just one more step, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes. I don't know how to be the husband you deserve. I wasn't raised for it. Wasn't taught how to be emotionally available or vulnerable or any of the things you need. But I want to learn, not because it's my duty or because society expects it or because it's the strategic thing to do, but because you make me want to be better than what I am. Leora's expression flickered. Something that might have been hope or might have been pain. 3 years, Cassian. You had 3 years to figure this out. I know. Why now? Why not 6 months ago? A year ago? Why did it take me leaving for you to finally see what you were doing? Because I'm a coward. The words came out harsh, raw. I convinced myself our marriage was fine because facing the truth would have meant admitting I was failing at the one thing that actually mattered. And I'm very, very good at lying to myself. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His hand touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. But I can't lie anymore. Not to you. Not to myself. I love you, Leora. I think I've loved you from the moment I met you. And I've wasted 3 years running from that truth because I was too afraid to let myself feel it. Leora's breath caught. Fresh tears spilled over. You can't just say that. You can't show up here and say everything I've been desperate to hear for 3 years and expect it to fix. I don't expect it to fix anything. Cassian's voice was steady now. Sure. This was the truth, and he was done running from it. I expect you to be furious, to tell me to go to hell, to say I had my chance, and I destroyed it, and now I have to live with that. And if that's what you decide, I'll accept it. I'll give you the divorce you deserve, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I lost the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too damaged to recognize it. His hand was still on her face. She hadn't pulled away. But before I accept that, before I let you go forever, I needed you to know the truth. You are not invisible. You are not worthless. You are the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and for 3 years I've been the luckiest bastard in England without having the sense to appreciate it. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. I see you now, Leora. Finally, completely. And if you give me another chance, I swear to God I will spend every single day proving it to you." The silence that followed was endless. Leora stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his, her breath shallow. Cassian's hand was still on her face, his thumb tracing slow circles on her cheekbone. He could feel her trembling, could see the war happening behind her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe him. He could see it. The part that still loved him despite everything, that had been waiting 3 years to hear these exact words. But there was another part. The part that had been broken and ignored and emotionally starved. The part that knew words were easy and change was hard, and men didn't transform overnight just because they finally admitted the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I want to believe you, but you don't." "I don't know." She pulled back and his hand fell away. "You're saying all the right things, Cassian. Every word I've been desperate to hear. But how do I know this isn't just panic? Fear of losing your perfect duchess, your social position, your carefully ordered life? How do I know you won't go back to who you were the moment I return?" "You don't." The honesty of it seemed to surprise her. Cassian stepped back, giving her space. "You have every reason not to trust me. I've given you 3 years of evidence that I'm incapable of emotional intimacy, that I'll always choose control over connection, and nothing I say right now can prove that's changed. So why should I listen to you? Because I'm not asking you to trust my words. I'm asking you to let me prove it with actions." She studied him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going back to Ravenhold. I'm staying here, at the village inn if your father won't let me stay in the house. And I'm going to court you." "Court me?" "We're married." "Exactly. We got married without really knowing each other, without building the foundation that should have come first. So I'm going to do it now, the right way. I'm going to take you to dinner and ask about your day and actually listen to the answers. I'm going to walk through gardens with you and attend concerts you want to see and learn what makes you laugh. I'm going to show you every single day that I see you, that I value you, that you matter more to me than anything else in my life." Leora's expression was still guarded, but something had shifted. A crack in the armor. "For how long?" "As long as it takes. A week? A month? A year? However long you need to believe that this is real. And if I never believe it, then I'll have spent whatever time you give me being the husband I should have been from the start. And when you finally tell me it's over, I'll at least know I tried." He held her gaze, letting her see everything. The fear, the hope, the desperate, terrifying love he'd been denying for so long. "I can't promise I'll be perfect at this. I've spent 20 years building walls and it's going to take time to tear them down. I'll probably mess up. Retreat into old patterns, disappoint you in new and creative ways. But I can promise I'll try. Every single day I'll try." Leora wrapped her arms around herself. She looked small suddenly, fragile. All the strength she'd shown when telling him off was cracking, revealing the vulnerability underneath. "I'm so tired." "Cassian, I know. I've been fighting for 3 years, fighting to be seen, fighting to matter, fighting to save a marriage that felt like it was drowning me. And I'm just exhausted." "Then stop fighting." He moved closer again, slowly, carefully. "Let me be the one who fights for you this time." Her face crumpled. The tears came harder now, 3 years of suppressed pain finally breaking through. And this time, when Cassian reached for her, she didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms around her and held on tight. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed, her whole body shaking. He pressed his face into her hair and let himself feel it. All the pain he'd caused, all the damage he'd done, all the time he'd wasted. "I'm sorry." The words were barely a whisper against her hair. "I'm so sorry." She didn't answer, just clung to him and cried like her heart was breaking. And Cassian held her through it all, because it was the only thing he could do. The only thing that mattered. Masi. They stood like that for a long time. Long enough that the sun climbed higher in the sky. Long enough that Cassian's legs started to ache. Long enough that Leora's tears finally slowed, then stopped. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red. She'd never looked more beautiful to him. "I look terrible. You look real," she laughed. It was small and wet and utterly perfect. "That's a diplomatic answer. It's the truth." He brushed hair back from her face. "I've spent 3 years looking at you and only seeing the Duchess. The perfectly composed, flawlessly dressed, socially appropriate Duchess. This is the first time I've seen just you. Well, you're seeing me at my worst. No, I'm seeing you at your most honest, and that's infinitely more valuable. Leora took a shaky breath. I need time. I know. I need to think about this. About what I want. About whether I can actually trust you to follow through. I understand. And I need you to understand that this isn't forgiveness. Not yet. This is just a possibility. A maybe. Nothing more. That's more than I deserve. She stepped back, creating distance between them. Her arms wrapped around herself again, a defensive posture he recognized now for what it was. Self-protection. My father will let you stay in the guest wing, but you sleep there, alone. We're not sharing a bed until I decide whether I want you in my life at all. Absolutely. And we're not telling anyone about this. Not yet. As far as society knows, I'm still just visiting family. Whatever you want. She studied him for another long moment, then nodded once, decisive. All right, you can stay, but Cassian, yes? If you hurt me again, if you retreat back into that cold, distant version of yourself, I'm done. Completely. There won't be another chance after this. I understand. I mean it. One strike, and you're out. I believe you. Good. She turned toward the house, then paused. And Cassian, thank you for coming here, for being honest, for finally letting me see you. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the garden with the morning sun warming his face and his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. He'd done it. Torn down every defense, exposed every fear, offered himself completely. And she hadn't rejected him, hadn't sent him away. She'd given him a chance. Now came the hard part, actually proving he could change. Richard Ashbourne was waiting in the library when Cassian entered the house. The older man looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. You talked to her? Yes. And you're still alive. That's promising. Cassian almost smiled. Barely. Richard folded his newspaper carefully, set it aside, gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down, boy. We need to talk. Cassian sat. He felt like he was 12 years old again, being called into the headmaster's office. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable and oddly grounding at the same time. Richard leaned back in his chair, his hand steepled in front of him. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. Do you love my daughter? Yes. How long have you known? Probably from the beginning. I just refuse to admit it. Why? Because I'm an idiot. Richard's mouth twitched. That's honest, at least. He leaned forward. I watched you grow up, Cassian. Watched you turn yourself into a fortress after your parents died. And I understood it. Lord knows I would have done the same in your position. But fortresses are for keeping enemies out, not wives. I'm starting to realize that. Are you? Because understanding something intellectually and actually changing your behavior are two very different things. Richard's gaze was sharp, intense. I've seen men make grand promises and dramatic gestures and then slide right back into their old patterns the moment things get comfortable. If you do that to Leora, if you break her heart again, I will personally destroy you. I don't care how powerful you are or how much influence you have. I will make it my life's mission to ruin you. The threat should have angered him. Instead, Cassian felt something like relief. I'd expect nothing less. Good. Richard's expression softened slightly. Now, you're staying in the East Guest Wing. Third door on the right. I'll have the staff prepare it. You'll take your meals with the family unless Leora specifically requests otherwise. And you will be on your absolute best behavior, or I'll throw you out myself. Clear? Crystal. And Cassian, one more thing, yes? If you manage to fix this, if you actually prove you can be the husband she deserves, you'll have my blessing. But until then, you're on probation. Act accordingly. The guest wing was beautiful, elegant, comfortable. Cassian hated every inch of it, not because there was anything wrong with the accommodations, but because this room represented exactly what he'd done to his marriage. He'd kept Leora at a distance, maintained separation, treated intimacy like a negotiable contract term. And now he was sleeping alone in a guest room in her family's house, separated from her by 3 floors and an ocean of broken trust. This was what he deserved. What? He unpacked the few things he'd brought with him, a change of clothes, basic toiletries, nothing more. He'd left Ravenhold in such a hurry, he hadn't even thought about luggage. Would have to send for more of his things if he was staying longer than a few days. When he was staying longer, He had to believe that. Had to believe she'd give him the time he needed to prove himself. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." A servant entered, young and nervous. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace. Dinner is served at 7. Lord Ashbourne requests your presence in the drawing room at 6:30. Thank you." The servant bobbed a curtsy and left. Cassian glanced at the clock. It was barely noon. He had 6.5 hours to figure out how to be a normal human being in a social situation. 6.5 hours to prepare for his first real test. At 6:25, Cassian descended the main staircase. He dressed carefully, not in his usual formal ducal attire, but in something softer. A simple jacket, no cravat, no ostentatious displays of wealth or status. He wanted to look approachable, human. He had no idea if he'd succeeded. The drawing room was already occupied. Richard stood by the window with a glass of whiskey. Lady Catherine sat in a high-backed chair, her expression carefully neutral. And Leora stood by the fireplace in a pale green dress that made her skin glow. She looked up when he entered, and for just a second something flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by polite distance. "Your Grace!" Catherine's voice was cool. "How lovely of you to join us." The formality was deliberate, a reminder that he was a guest here, not family. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Lady Ashbourne, thank you for your hospitality." Richard handed him a glass of whiskey without asking if he wanted it. "Sit down, Cassian. You're making the room feel crowded." Cassian sat. The silence that followed was excruciating. This was his life now. Navigating social situations where everyone knew he'd failed spectacularly at the one thing that should have been easiest, making small talk with his in-laws, while his wife stood across the room treating him like a stranger. Catherine broke the silence first. "Leora tells us you'll be staying for a while, if that's acceptable. It's her decision, not mine." Catherine's gaze was sharp. "Though I'll admit I'm curious about your sudden interest in extended visits. You've never seemed particularly fond of family gatherings before." Direct hit. Cassian absorbed it without flinching. "You're right. I've been neglectful of family obligations. I'm hoping to change that." Hoping is an interesting choice of words. It implies uncertainty. I am uncertain. This is new territory for me. The honesty seemed to surprise her. Catherine's expression shifted slightly. Less hostile, more evaluating. "At least you're not pretending to have all the answers." "I don't have any answers, just a willingness to learn." Richard snorted into his whiskey. "That's more self-awareness than you've shown in 3 years." Leora spoke for the first time. "Father." "What?" "I'm just being honest. The boy's been an emotional cripple. If he's finally admitting it, we should encourage that." Cassian could have been offended. Should have been, probably. Instead, he felt something like gratitude. This was what real family looked like. Messy, confrontational, honest. Everything his own family had never been. "You're right," he said quietly. "I have been emotionally crippled. And I'm trying to fix that. But I understand if none of you believe I can." Catherine set down her teacup. The delicate china clinked against the saucer. "Tell me something, Your Grace." "Why now? What changed?" Cassian looked at Leora. She was watching him with an unreadable expression. "I realized that being powerful and being alone were not the same thing, and I'd rather be weak and loved than strong and empty." The room went very quiet. Catherine's eyes narrowed. "That's either the most honest thing you've ever said or the most calculated manipulation I've heard in 40 years of society politics. It's honest." He didn't look away from Leora. "I have nothing left to gain from manipulation. Either she believes me or she doesn't. Either I change or I don't. But I'm done pretending I don't need her." Dinner was a special kind of torture. They sat at a table designed for 12, the 4 of them clustered at one end. Cassian was acutely aware of every movement, every word, every glance exchanged between Leora and her parents. This was what family dinners were supposed to be. Conversation. Laughter. The easy intimacy of people who genuinely cared about each other. Everything his own dinners with Leora had never been. Catherine asked about the estates. Richard discussed politics. Leora contributed thoughts on both with an intelligence and insight that made Cassian realize, with growing horror, how much he'd underestimated her. She wasn't just beautiful or well-bred or socially appropriate. She was brilliant, sharp, funny in a dry, subtle way that caught him off guard. How had he missed this? How had he spent 3 years married to this extraordinary woman and never bothered to actually know her? At one point, Leora mentioned a book she'd been reading, some philosophical treatise on governance and social contract. Cassian had read it years ago. "What did you think of the author's argument about individual liberty versus collective responsibility?" he asked. The table went quiet. Leora looked at him with surprise. "I think he makes a compelling case for balance, that neither extreme serves society well. True freedom requires structure, but structure without freedom becomes tyranny. And in a marriage?" The question came out before he could stop it. "How do you balance individual autonomy with collective commitment?" Leora's eyes locked on his. "You trust that your partner values your autonomy as much as the commitment, that they won't use the structure of marriage to erase your individual identity." The subtext was clear. "You failed at that." "You're right," Cassian said quietly. "Structure without freedom is tyranny. I made our marriage into exactly that." Richard coughed into his napkin. Catherine's eyebrows rose, but Leora's expression softened, just slightly. But enough. The rest of the dinner passed in careful conversation. Cassian participated but didn't dominate. Asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Laughed at Richard's terrible jokes and complimented Catherine's choice of wine and tried, desperately, to be present instead of controlled. It was exhausting. It was also the most alive he'd felt in years. After dinner, Leora excused herself to her chambers. Cassian watched her go, fighting every instinct to follow, to push, to demand resolution. But that was the old way, the controlling way, the way that had destroyed everything. So he let her go and stayed downstairs with her parents, nursing a glass of port and trying to be social. Richard eventually took pity on him. "You look like you're about to jump out of your skin. I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." The older man settled into a chair by the fire. "Come here, sit down." Cassian obeyed. Richard studied him for a long moment. "You really love her?" It wasn't a question. "More than I knew it was possible to love someone." "Then why the hell did you treat her so badly?" "Because I'm damaged." Cassian stared into his port glass. "Because I watched love destroy my mother and convinced myself it was the enemy. Because I'm a coward who chose control over connection and called it strength." Richard was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're not nearly as broken as you believe you are. I think you're just a man who was hurt young and never learned how to trust anyone with your heart. And that's fixable, if you're willing to do the work." "I'm willing." "Are you?" "Because it's going to be hard, Cassian. Harder than anything you've done before. Building empires and accumulating wealth and wielding political power, that's easy compared to actual emotional intimacy. That requires daily, consistent vulnerability. No walls, no escape routes. Just showing up every single day and choosing connection over safety. I know. Do you?" Richard leaned forward. "Because I've seen men make these promises before. Hell, I made them myself early in my marriage to Catherine. Swore I'd be better, more present, more emotionally available. And for a few weeks, I was. Then work got busy and old patterns crept back in, and before I knew it, I was right back where I started." "What changed?" "Catherine called me on it, told me I had 1 month to prove I meant what I said or she was leaving. Best thing that ever happened to me." Richard smiled, but there was steel in it. Forced me to actually follow through instead of just making promises. So I'm going to tell you what I wish someone had told me. Words are cheap. Intentions are meaningless. The only thing that matters is consistent action over time. How long? The older man shrugged. However long it takes. Could be weeks. Could be months. Could be years. But every single day you have to choose her. Over work, over comfort, over the easy path of retreating into old habits. Every single day. And if I fail, then you lose her permanently. And you spend the rest of your life knowing you had everything and threw it away twice. Cassian didn't sleep that night. He lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything that had happened. The confrontation in the garden, Leora's tears, her conditional acceptance, the dinner, the conversation with Richard, every single day. That was the price. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic transformation, just consistent, daily choice to be present, to be vulnerable, to prioritize her over everything else. Could he do it? He didn't know, but he had to try. Around 3 in the morning, Cassian gave up on sleep entirely. He got dressed and wandered downstairs, drawn by restless energy and the need to move. The house was dark and silent. He found himself in the library, surrounded by books he'd never read and comfortable chairs he'd never sat in. This was Leora's childhood home. These were the rooms where she'd grown up, the spaces that had shaped her. He knew nothing about any of it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd married her without knowing her favorite childhood memory, her first heartbreak, the books that made her cry or the music that made her dance. He'd taken vows to spend his life with her and never bothered to learn who she actually was. No wonder she'd left. Cassian sank into one of the chairs and let his head fall into his hands. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. Not the grand gestures or the emotional confessions. Those were actually easy. Adrenaline and desperation could carry you through moments of crisis. It was the daily work that terrified him. The small, consistent choices to connect instead of withdraw, to ask questions and listen to answers, to be present even when it was uncomfortable. He'd spent 20 years training himself to do the exact opposite. Could he really reprogram 2 decades of conditioning? I couldn't sleep either. Cassian's head snapped up. Leora stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked softer like this, more approachable. Less like the perfect Duchess, and more like a woman who couldn't sleep because her world had just turned upside down. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding. This is my father's library. You're welcome here. She moved into the room, running her fingers along the spines of books as she passed. Cassian watched her, not sure if he should speak or stay silent. Leora made the decision for him. I used to hide in here when I was a child. Whenever my parents were fighting or I was upset about something, I'd come down here and read until I felt better. What would you read? Everything. Poetry, philosophy, terrible romance novels I wasn't supposed to have access to. She smiled slightly. I think I've read every book in this room at least twice. Do you have a favorite? She pulled a slim volume from the shelf. Wordsworth. She handed it to him. Read the one on page 47. Cassian opened the book carefully. Found the page, read aloud in the quiet library. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. His voice was rough with lack of sleep and emotion. He continued through the stanzas, aware of Leora watching him the entire time. When he finished, she was smiling, truly smiling. That was my mother's favorite poem. She used to read it to me when I couldn't sleep. Something about the rhythm always calmed me down. It's beautiful. It's about finding unexpected joy, about stumbling onto something so lovely it changes your entire perspective. Leora took the book back from him, their fingers brushed. I used to believe that's what love would be like. Unexpected and transformative and beautiful. And then you married me. The words hung heavy between them. Leora set the book down carefully. Yes, then I married you, and learned that love can also be lonely and painful and exhausting. I'm sorry. I know you are. She looked at him directly. But sorry doesn't fix 3 years of loneliness, Cassian. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering what was wrong with me. Sorry doesn't make up for all the times I tried to reach you and hit a wall instead. You're right, it doesn't. So what does? Cassian stood up slowly, moved closer to her. Not touching, but near enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The pain. The fragile hope she was trying so hard to protect. Time. Consistency. Proving every single day that I see you, that I value you, that I'm choosing you over everything else. And if I don't believe you can do that, then I'll keep trying anyway, until you tell me to stop. They stood in the quiet library, surrounded by books and shadows and the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Leora spoke. I'm going back to bed. You should too. All right. She turned to leave, then paused. Cassian? Yes? Thank you for reading to me. My father never did that. Said poetry was frivolous. It's not frivolous. It's beautiful, like you. The compliment made her blush. She looked away quickly. Good night, Cassian. Good night, Leora. She left. And Cassian stood alone in the library, holding a volume of Wordsworth and feeling, for the first time in 3 years, like maybe he could actually do this. Maybe he could change. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. The next morning brought new challenges. Cassian came down to breakfast at 8, late by his usual standards, but he'd wanted to give Leora space to eat first if she wanted. She was already at the table. The sight of her in the morning light, reading a newspaper and sipping tea, hit him with unexpected force. This was what he'd denied himself for 3 years. Simple domestic intimacy. Sharing breakfast. Being in the same room without agenda or obligation. "May I join you?" She looked up, surprised. "Of course." He sat down carefully. A servant appeared immediately with coffee. Cassian accepted it with thanks. Actually thanked them, using their name, something he never did at Ravenhold. Leora noticed. Her eyebrows rose fractionally. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Cassian found himself hyper-aware of every sound. The clink of her spoon against porcelain, the rustle of newspaper pages, her breathing. This was excruciating and also wonderful, and he had no idea what to say. "What are your plans for today?" The question came out more formal than he'd intended. Leora set down her teacup. "I'm helping organize the village charity bazaar. We're raising funds for the school expansion." "That sounds important." "It is. The current building can barely hold 40 students. We need at least double that capacity." "What's the fundraising target?" £800. "And how much have you raised so far?" "About 300. We're hoping the bazaar will get us most of the way there." Cassian did quick mental math. "I'd like to contribute. Would a direct donation of £500 be acceptable?" Leora's eyes widened. That's very generous. It's an investment in education. Nothing more important." She studied him for a long moment. "You're trying very hard." "I am. It's noticeable. Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet." She picked up her newspaper again. "But thank you for the donation. The children will benefit enormously." They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, less hostile, more like two people learning how to exist in the same space. Progress. Small. Tentative. But real. After breakfast, Leora left for the village. Cassian watched her go, fighting the urge to follow, to insert himself into her activities, to control the situation. Instead, he went to find Richard. "I need your help." The older man looked up from his correspondence. "With what?" "Learning how to be a human being." Richard took him seriously. Over the next few days, he subjected Cassian to what could only be described as emotional boot camp. Lessons in basic human interaction. How to have a conversation without turning it into a strategy session. How to ask questions because you actually cared about the answer, not because you were gathering intelligence. How to be present without an agenda. It was humbling and necessary, and harder than any business negotiation Cassian had ever conducted. The third day, Richard took him to the village, made him volunteer at the charity bazaar, put him to work at the bookstall, selling used novels to farmers and craftsmen who couldn't have cared less that he was a duke. Cassian hated every minute of it, and also learned more about people in 3 hours than he had in 3 years of society events. The baker's wife who was saving up for new reading glasses, the blacksmith who loved poetry but couldn't afford his own collection, the young mother who wanted educational books for her children but had to choose between that and new shoes. These were Leora's people, the community she'd been serving while he was locked away in his fortress of control. She'd been doing real work, making real impact, while he'd been managing investments and accumulating wealth that benefited no one but himself. Late in the afternoon, Leora came by the bookstall. She stopped short when she saw him. "You came. Your father insisted." That was a lie. Richard had suggested it, but Cassian had agreed immediately. Had wanted to see where she spent her time, what she cared about, but he couldn't quite bring himself to admit that yet. Leora looked at the depleted stacks around him. "You've sold quite a lot. People like books. They do. Especially when the Duke of Ravenhold is personally recommending them." Cassian smiled slightly. "I may have leveraged my title a bit. Smart." She moved closer, examining the remaining inventory. "What did you recommend?" "Whatever seemed appropriate for each person. Poetry for the blacksmith, agricultural texts for the farmers, a romance novel for Mrs. Henderson, though I suspect she'll pretend it's for her daughter." Leora laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was so unexpected and so perfect that Cassian felt something crack open in his chest. "You're actually good at this." "Don't sound so surprised." "I am surprised. You've spent 3 years convincing me you're incapable of connecting with normal people. I'm capable. I just chose not to. Why? Because it's easier to stay detached, safer, less complicated. And now? Now I'm realizing that easy and safe are synonyms for empty and alone. They stood together in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the gentle chaos of the bazaar. Children running between stalls, neighbors chatting, the smell of baked goods and fresh flowers. This was life. Real, messy, imperfect life. And Cassian was standing in the middle of it, talking to his wife like they were actual partners instead of strangers sharing a last name. It felt revolutionary. That night, Leora asked him to walk with her in the garden. It was the first time she'd voluntarily sought his company since he'd arrived. Cassian tried not to read too much into it, but his heart was pounding as they made their way through the twilit grounds. They walked in silence at first, just moving together through the familiar paths, their footsteps synchronized. Finally, Leora spoke. "You did well today. At the bazaar. Thank you. The people liked you. That's rare. Usually they're intimidated by aristocracy. I tried to be less intimidating." She smiled. "You succeeded." "Mr. Henderson said you gave his daughter excellent advice about which books would help with her studies. And Mrs. Patterson was singing your praises for remembering her grandson's name." "I have a good memory." "That's not just memory, Cassian. That's caring enough to use it." He didn't know what to say to that. They walked further, deeper into the garden where the shadows grew longer. "My father tells me you've been asking him for advice. He's been generous with his time." "He likes you more than he lets on." Leora paused by a fountain, trailing her fingers through the water. "He sees something in you that I'm still trying to find." "What do you see?" "Honestly?" She turned to face him. "I see a man who's trying very hard, who's saying all the right things and making all the right gestures. But I don't know if I see real change yet, or if I'm just seeing performance." The words stung, but they were fair. How do I prove it's real? Time. Consistency. No grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Just showing up every day and being present. That's what your father said. He's right. She sat down on the edge of the fountain. "You want to know the truth, Cassian?" "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "That I'm going to start believing you. That I'm going to let my guard down and trust you again. And then 6 months from now, a year from now, you'll slide back into old patterns and I'll be right back where I started. Except worse, because this time I'll know exactly what I'm missing. I won't do that. You can't know that." Neither of us can. Change is hard. Maintaining change is harder. And you're trying to reprogram 20 years of emotional conditioning in a few weeks. So you don't think I can do it? Leora looked at him with devastating honesty. "I don't know. I want to believe you can. But belief isn't the same as certainty. And I'm not sure I can survive being wrong again." The fountain bubbled gently behind her. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called out. The world continued turning, indifferent to their pain. Cassian sat down beside her. Not touching, but close enough to feel her warmth. "When I was 12, I made myself a promise. Never depend on anyone. Never need anyone. Never give anyone the power to hurt me. And I kept that promise for 20 years. It shaped every decision I made, every relationship I avoided, every wall I built." He stared at the water, watched it catch the last rays of sunset. "But here's what I didn't understand. Keeping that promise meant I never really lived. I survived. I achieved. I dominated. But I never actually experienced life, never felt joy or connection or love. I was a ghost in my own existence." He looked at her. Really looked at her. Saw the fear and the hope warring in her expression. "You want certainty. And I can't give you that. I can't promise I won't mess up or retreat into old habits or disappoint you. But I can promise that for the first time in my life, I'm willing to break my promise to myself. I'm willing to need you, to depend on you, to give you the power to absolutely destroy me." Tears gathered in her eyes. "That's terrifying." "It is, for both of us. What if we can't do this? What if we try and it still doesn't work? Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll know we gave it everything we had." Leora reached out slowly. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwined. The simple gesture felt monumental. "I'm still angry at you." "I know. And I'm not ready to forgive you. I know that too. But I'm willing to see if we can build something new. Not the marriage we had. Something better. That's all I'm asking for. They sat together as the sun set completely, as the garden grew dark around them, as the stars began to appear overhead. And for the first time in 3 years, Cassian felt something that might have been hope. The following week brought a test neither of them expected. A letter arrived from Ravenhold. Urgent business requiring the Duke's immediate attention. A dispute with a neighboring landowner over water rights that was threatening to escalate into legal action. The old Cassian would have left immediately, would have prioritized the crisis over everything else, would have told Leora he'd be back when the matter was resolved, and then wondered why she was upset. The new Cassian stared at the letter and felt his carefully constructed progress teetering on the edge. Leora found him in the library, the letter crumpled in his fist. "What's wrong?" He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it quickly, her expression shifting. "You need to go." "I don't want to." "Cassian, this is serious. If Pemberton files a lawsuit, it could cost you thousands of pounds. Maybe more." "I know." "Then why are you hesitating?" "Because the moment I leave, you'll think I've chosen the estate over you." "And you'll be right." Leora set down the letter. Her expression was complicated, conflicted. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Real life doesn't stop just because we're trying to fix our marriage. You have responsibilities, obligations, and I can't ask you to ignore them. You're not asking, I am choosing. But you shouldn't have to choose. That's the problem. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to abandon everything else in your life." Cassian stood up, moved toward her. "So what do I do? How do I handle this without destroying what we're building?" Leora was quiet for a long moment. Then she took a breath. "Go to Ravenhold. Handle the crisis. But promise me something. Anything. Come back. Don't get sucked back into the patterns. Don't disappear into work and forget about this. Give yourself 3 days to resolve the situation, then come back. Whether it's finished or not. 3 days. 3 days. And write to me. Every day. Not formal letters. Real letters. Tell me what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what you're struggling with. I can do that. Can you? Because the moment you're back in your element, surrounded by all your old routines, it's going to be very easy to slip back into old habits. I know, but I won't. I promise you, Leora. 3 days and I come back. No matter what." She searched his face, looking for the lie, the loophole, the excuse he'd used to justify staying away. She didn't find one. "All right, go. Handle your crisis." "But Cassian." "Yes?" "If you don't come back in 3 days, don't come back at all." The return to Ravenhold was jarring. Cassian rode through the gates and felt the weight of the place settling back onto his shoulders. The castle loomed above him, all dark stone and sharp angles, a monument to power and control and everything he'd been trying to move away from. The staff greeted him with perfect formality. Whitmore appeared within moments, briefing him on the situation. "Lord Pemberton is claiming water rights based on a century-old agreement. He's threatening to divert the stream that feeds your tenant farms unless you concede." "Has he filed suit yet?" "Not yet, but his solicitor sent a formal letter of intent this morning. Set up a meeting, tomorrow morning, and get our land surveys from the archives. I want to see every document related to that stream going back 200 years. "Yes, Your Grace." The machinery of his old life clicked into gear immediately. Efficient. Productive. Completely consuming. By midnight, Cassian was surrounded by documents, maps and surveys and legal text. His mind was fully engaged in the problem, analyzing angles and strategies. It felt familiar, comfortable, like putting on a well-worn coat. And that's when he realized how easy it would be to stay here, to solve this crisis and then move on to the next one. To let the work swallow him whole and forget about gardens and poetry and a wife who was giving him one last chance. He put down the survey he was reading, picked up a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. "Dearest Leora, I'm back at Ravenhold and I hate it. Not the place itself, but what it represents. The person I was here. The life I built around control and isolation. I've been working for 6 hours straight, and I just realized I haven't thought about you since I arrived. Not because I don't care, but because it's so easy to fall back into old patterns when you're surrounded by familiar triggers. But I'm thinking about you now. About our conversation by the fountain. About your hand in mine. About the way you smiled when I sold books to the blacksmith. I'm scared, Leora. Scared that I'm going to mess this up. Scared that I'll get so absorbed in solving problems here that I'll forget what actually matters. Scared that you're right and I can't actually change. But I'm writing this letter anyway. Because you asked me to. Because I promised you 3 days. Because for the first time in my life, I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of feeling vulnerable. I'll write again tomorrow, and the day after, and then I'm coming back to you. Whether this crisis is resolved or not. Yours, Cassian. He sealed the letter and had it sent immediately. Then he returned to his work. But something had shifted. He was still focused, still strategic. But now there was a clock ticking in the back of his mind. 3 days. Then he went back. No matter what. The meeting with Pemberton was brutal. The man was everything Cassian normally excelled at crushing. Arrogant, entitled, convinced he could bully the Duke into submission. Under normal circumstances, Cassian would have destroyed him, would have found every legal loophole, every historical precedent, every pressure point to force capitulation. But these weren't normal circumstances. Cassian listened to Pemberton's demands, reviewed the evidence, and then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He negotiated, not from a position of domination, but from genuine problem solving. What did Pemberton actually need? Water access for his tenant farms. What did Cassian need? The same thing. So instead of fighting over who had historical rights, why not find a solution that benefited both? By the end of the day, they drafted an agreement. Shared water rights, joint maintenance responsibilities. A partnership instead of a conflict. Pemberton left looking confused but satisfied. Cassian's solicitors looked like they'd witnessed a miracle. Your Grace, that was. Unexpected. Effective? Yes, but then it was the right approach. Sometimes winning means finding mutual benefit instead of total domination. He wrote to Leora that night, told her about the negotiation, about choosing collaboration over conquest, about how different it felt to solve a problem without crushing the other person. Her response arrived the next morning, short but significant. I'm proud of you. 3 words. But they meant everything. On the 3rd day, Cassian rode back to the Ashbourne estate. The water rights issue wasn't completely resolved. There were still details to iron out, documents to sign, implementation to oversee. His steward could handle most of it, but normally Cassian would have stayed to manage every detail personally. Not this time. He'd made a promise. 3 days. And 3 days was all he was taking. He arrived at sunset, dismounted in the drive, handed his horse to a groom, and walked directly to the garden. Leora was there, sitting on the same bench where they'd talked a week ago. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face transformed. Relief, joy, something that looked dangerously close to love. You came back. I promised you 3 days. The crisis is resolved? Mostly. There's still work to do. But it can wait. Cassian walked to the bench, sat down beside her, took her hand. I need you to understand something. There will always be work. Always another crisis. Always something demanding my attention. And if I let it, it will consume everything. Consume us. I know. So I'm making a choice right now, in this moment. You matter more than water rights or business deals or any other crisis that will inevitably arise. And I'm going to keep making that choice every single day, for as long as you'll let me. Leora's eyes filled with tears. How do I know you mean it? Because I'm here. Because I kept my promise. Because I wrote to you every day, even when I was exhausted and overwhelmed. Because I negotiated instead of dominated. Because I'm learning, Leora. Slowly, imperfectly. But I'm learning. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon. I'm still scared, she whispered. So am I. But I think I'm ready to try. Really try. Not just test you to see if you'll fail, but actually work on building something new together. Cassian pressed his face into her hair. Thank God. Because I don't know what I would have done if you'd said no. You would have kept trying anyway. Yes. But it would have killed me. They stayed like that until full dark. Until the stars came out. Until the garden grew cold and they had no choice but to go inside. But this time, when they walked back to the house, they walked together, hand in hand. And for the first time since their wedding, Cassian felt like they might actually make it. 2 weeks after Cassian returned from Ravenhold, they fell into a rhythm. Not the sterile, controlled routine of their previous marriage. Something different, messier, more honest. They took breakfast together every morning, walked through the gardens in the afternoons, spent evenings reading in the library, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. Cassian learned that Leora hated mushrooms but loved strawberries, that she played piano when she was anxious, that she had a wicked sense of humor hidden beneath all that Duchess propriety. And she learned that beneath his icy exterior, Cassian was capable of laughter, of vulnerability, of asking for help when he didn't understand something. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when he retreated into old patterns, when she pulled away, still guarding her heart. But they were trying, actually trying. Richard watched it all with cautious approval. Catherine remained skeptical but warming, and Cassian began to believe for the first time that they might actually survive this. That's when everything shattered. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Cassian was in the breakfast room with Leora, listening to her talk about the new school building plans, when Whitmore appeared in the doorway. His face was ashen. "Your Grace, a courier just arrived from Ravenhold. He says it's urgent." Cassian took the sealed envelope, frowning. Urgent correspondence was rare. He'd specifically instructed his steward not to bother him unless the estate was literally on fire. He broke the seal and read. The color drained from his face. "Cassian?" Leora's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" He couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was reading. The words swam in front of his eyes, rearranging themselves into nightmare configurations. "Cassian, you're scaring me." He handed her the letter with shaking hands. Leora read it. Her expression shifted from concern to confusion to absolute horror. The letter was from his head solicitor, Marcus Brennan, the man Cassian had trusted for 15 years to manage his legal affairs. The man who had access to every contract, every investment, every financial document related to the Vale estates. The man who had just embezzled £400,000 and disappeared. Here's what people don't understand about betrayal. It's not the loss itself that destroys you. Money can be recovered. Assets can be rebuilt. Even massive financial damage can be repaired with time and strategy. What breaks you is the realization that your judgment was wrong, that the person you trusted implicitly, the one you gave power over your entire empire, was a liar from the beginning. That while you were rebuilding your marriage and learning to be vulnerable and opening yourself up to human connection, someone was systematically destroying everything you'd built. And the worst part? You never saw it coming, because you were too busy trying to be a better person to notice the knife sliding between your ribs. Cassian sat in Richard's study, the letter crumpled in his fist, and felt his entire world tilting sideways. £400,000. Gone. Brennan had been moving money for months. Small amounts at first, disguised as legitimate transactions, then larger transfers, hidden in the complexity of international investments and shell companies. By the time anyone noticed, he'd vanished. No forwarding address, no trail, just gone. Along with a fortune that represented years of careful accumulation. It wasn't enough to bankrupt the Vale estates. Cassian's wealth was too diversified, too carefully managed. But it was enough to cause serious damage, enough to force the sale of properties, enough to impact tenant farms and staff positions and all the people who depended on the duchy for their livelihoods. Enough to make Cassian look like a fool. Richard poured him a whiskey, drank. "What are you going to do?" Cassian stared at the amber liquid. "I don't know. You need to go back. Immediately. Contain the damage. Find out how deep this goes." "I know, and you need to involve the authorities. File charges. Put out a warrant for his arrest." "Yes." Richard studied him. "But you don't want to leave." "No. I don't want to leave. Because of Leora. Because I promised her. 3 days for a crisis. And this is the biggest crisis I've ever faced. But if I leave now, if I disappear back into work to handle this, she'll think I was lying. That everything I've said for the past 2 weeks was performance. That the moment real trouble hit, I chose the estate over her." Richard set down his glass. "Were you lying?" "No." "Then she'll understand." "Will she?" Cassian looked up, and for the first time since receiving the letter, he let Richard see the fear. Or will she see exactly what she's always seen? A man who says the right things, but when it matters, when there's actually a choice to be made, picks power and control over the people who need him? That's not what this is, isn't it? I'm going to leave her. Again. I'm going to get consumed by this crisis and work 20-hour days and barely sleep and forget to write and miss dinners. And it'll be justified this time because the threat is real, but the result is the same. I disappear. She's alone. And whatever we've been building collapses. So what's the alternative? Let Brennan destroy everything while you stay here playing house? The words were harsh, intentionally so. Richard was pushing him, forcing him to face the impossible choice. Cassian stood abruptly, walked to the window. Outside, Leora was in the garden with her mother, examining rose bushes. She looked peaceful, content, unaware that the fragile trust they'd been rebuilding was about to be tested in the worst possible way. There's no good choice here, Cassian said quietly. Either I abandon her and prove I haven't changed, or I stay and let my entire estate collapse around me. Either way, I lose. Then you choose which loss you can live with. Cassian found Leora in the music room an hour later. She was at the piano, playing something melancholy. Chopin, maybe. Her fingers moved across the keys with unconscious grace, her face distant, lost in the music. He watched from the doorway, memorizing the sight. This peaceful moment before he destroyed it. She noticed him eventually, stopped playing mid-phrase. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. Cassian stepped into the room. Leora, don't. Her voice was flat, dead. Just tell me how long. I don't know, weeks, maybe months. This is catastrophic, Leora. Brennan had access to everything. I need to do a complete audit, restructure my financial systems, track down every penny he moved. It's going to consume all my time. Of course it is. The bitterness in her tone cut deep. I don't want to go. But you are. I have to. If I don't handle this immediately, the damage will spread. Tenant farms will lose funding. Staff will lose positions. People who depend on me will suffer because I wasn't paying attention. Because you were here. With me. The accusation hung between them. Cassian moved closer. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? She stood up from the piano bench, her movements sharp. You got distracted, playing at being a real husband. And while you were busy courting me and writing letters and learning how to have conversations, your empire was falling apart. That's not fair, isn't it? Her eyes flashed. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Cassian. That you'd try to change and it would cost you everything. That you'd resent me for it. That we'd end up right back where we started, except now you'd blame me for the destruction. I don't blame you. Don't you? Because I can see it in your face, the calculation, the regret. You're already wondering if this was worth it. If trying to save our marriage was worth losing 400,000 pounds. Stop. Am I wrong? Tell me I'm wrong. Cassian wanted to say she was completely off base, that he didn't regret a single moment, that she mattered more than any amount of money. But he hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, Leora saw the truth. Her face crumpled. Oh, God. Leora, listen to me. No. She backed away from him. You don't get to do this. You don't get to make me feel guilty for your choices. You chose to come here, chose to stay, chose to prioritize our marriage. And now that it's cost you something, you're looking at me like I'm the reason your life is falling apart. That's not what's happening. Then what is happening, Cassian? Because from where I'm standing, this is the pattern repeating. Crisis hits. You leave. I'm alone. Except this time, I also get to carry the weight of knowing I distracted you from your responsibilities. That if you just stayed at Ravenhold being the cold, controlled duke you've always been, none of this would have happened. You're twisting this. Am I? Her voice broke. Or am I finally seeing clearly? You can't be both people, Cassian. You can't be the vulnerable husband who writes love letters and the ruthless duke who controls an empire. And when you're forced to choose, you'll always choose power. Because that's who you actually are. Cassian felt something inside him crack. The fragile hope he'd been nurturing for 2 weeks. The belief that he could actually change. The fantasy that love could coexist with the brutal demands of his position. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been deluding himself. I have to go, he said quietly. I don't want to, but I have to. I know. Leora's tears were falling freely now. And that's the problem. You always have to. There's always something more important. And I'm tired of being the thing you sacrifice for duty. What do you want me to do? Let everything collapse? Let my tenants lose their homes? Let my staff lose their positions? How is that more ethical than leaving you for a few weeks? It's not about ethics. Her voice rose to a shout. It's about the fact that in 3 years of marriage and 2 weeks of reconciliation, you have never once chosen me first. Not once. And I'm done pretending that's going to change. She walked toward the door. Cassian grabbed her wrist. Don't walk away from this. Let go of me. Not until you listen. There's nothing left to listen to. She pulled free. Go back to Ravenhold. Handle your crisis. Save your empire. And when you're done, when everything is secure and controlled and back under your dominion, don't come back here, because I won't be waiting. Leora. I mean it, Cassian. This is over. She left. The door slammed behind her with a finality that felt like a coffin closing. Cassian stood alone in the music room, surrounded by instruments that would never make sound as beautiful as her playing had been, and realized he'd just lost the only thing that actually mattered. Again? He left that night. Couldn't stand to stay another moment in that house, surrounded by the ghost of what they'd been building. Couldn't face Richard's disappointment or Catherine's "I told you so" expression. Couldn't bear the thought of seeing Leora at breakfast and watching her look through him like he didn't exist. So he rode through the darkness back to Ravenhold, pushing his horse harder than he should have, as if speed could outrun the pain tearing through his chest. The castle was exactly as he'd left it. Cold, dark, empty. Home. Whitmore was waiting, of course. Had probably been waiting since the courier left. His expression was carefully neutral, but Cassian could read the concern underneath. Your Grace, the estate managers are assembled in the war room. They've been conducting preliminary audits all day. Good. I'll meet with them immediately. Your Grace, perhaps you should rest first. You look, I said immediately. Whitmore bowed. Of course, Your Grace. The war room was chaos, 6 men around a massive table covered in documents. Financial statements, bank records, investment portfolios, all of it bleeding red ink, all of it evidence of Brennan's systematic theft. Cassian sat down at the head of the table and felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. This was what he knew. This was what he was good at. Crisis management, strategic problem solving, ruthless efficiency in the face of disaster. Report, he said. The head accountant, a nervous man named Hendricks, cleared his throat. It's worse than we initially thought, Your Grace. Brennan didn't just embezzle cash. He sold off several investment properties at below-market rates to shell companies he controlled, diverted rental income from the London holdings, even mortgaged 2 of the Scottish estates without authorization. How much total? Hendricks swallowed. Combined? Nearly £700,000. The room went silent. 700,000. Not 400. 700. Almost half of his liquid assets. Gone. Cassian felt something cold settle into his chest, the emotion draining away, the walls going back up, the ruthless Duke returning. This is what vulnerability cost him. This is what happens when you stop paying attention, when you let yourself get distracted by feelings and connection and the fantasy that you could be anything other than what you were built to be. Get the solicitors, he said. His voice was ice. All of them. I want warrants filed, criminal charges, civil suits. I want Brennan's entire life destroyed. His family, his reputation, everything. Your Grace, his family had nothing to do with... I don't care. Cassian stood. Make an example. Make it so brutal that no one will ever consider betraying me again. Am I clear? The men around the table exchanged glances. This was the Duke they knew. The one who crushed opposition without mercy. The one who treated loyalty as currency and betrayal as a capital offense. Crystal clear, Your Grace. Good. Cassian gathered the documents. I want hourly updates, complete asset inventory by morning, and find Brennan. I don't care if you have to hire every investigator in Europe. Find him. He left the room and climbed the stairs to his chambers. The same chambers he'd occupied for 20 years. The same bed where he'd slept alone for most of his marriage. Everything exactly as it had been. Except now the loneliness felt like punishment instead of safety. 3 days passed in a blur of meetings and audits and legal proceedings. Cassian barely slept, barely ate. He worked 18-hour days, tearing through financial records with methodical precision. Every hour revealed new damage, new betrayal, new evidence that Brennan had been stealing from him for years. And with every discovery, Cassian felt himself hardening. The softness he'd been cultivating, the vulnerability he'd been learning, all of it calcifying back into armor. This was what happened when you let people in. They destroyed you. Brennan had been more than a solicitor. He'd been a confidant, someone Cassian had trusted with his most sensitive affairs. And that trust had been weaponized against him. Just like his mother's trust in his father had destroyed her. Just like his trust in Leora had distracted him enough to miss this disaster until it was too late. On the fourth day, Richard Ashbourne arrived. Cassian was in his study, surrounded by documents, when Whitmore announced the visitor. He looked up with exhaustion-shadowed eyes. "I don't have time for social calls." "This isn't a social call." Richard walked in without waiting for permission. "You look like hell." "I'm busy. I can see that." The older man surveyed the chaos. "Trying to control the damage? Trying to rebuild what was destroyed while I was playing at being someone I'm not." Richard's expression hardened. "Is that what you think you were doing?" Cassian didn't answer, just turned back to his papers. Richard grabbed the document out of his hands and threw it across the room. "What the hell? You're doing it again. Retreating, building walls, convincing yourself that feeling anything was a mistake." "It was a mistake." Cassian stood. "I let myself get distracted, let my guard down. And while I was busy learning how to be vulnerable, Brennan was ransacking my estate. 700,000 pounds. Richard. 700,000. I know. Do you know what that means? How many people will suffer because I wasn't paying attention?" "You were paying attention to your wife. And look where that got me." Cassian's voice was bitter. "She was right. I can't be both. Can't be the devoted husband and the effective duke. Something always suffers. And I chose wrong. Did you?" "Yes." He slammed his hand on the desk. "I chose her. I chose vulnerability and connection and all the soft, weak things I was raised to avoid. And the result is disaster. So no, Richard, I'm not retreating. I'm correcting a catastrophic error in judgment." The older man studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that? I know it. Then you're an idiot." Cassian's eyes flashed. "Get out." "No." Richard moved closer. "You want to know what I think?" "I think you're terrified. Not of the financial damage, not even of Brennan's betrayal. You're terrified because for the first time in your life, you let yourself care about something more than control. And the universe punished you for it. So now you're running back to what's safe. Back to being the ruthless duke who trusts no one and feels nothing. Because it works. Does it? Where's Brennan now? In custody? Or still out there with your money, laughing at how easy you were to steal from?" Cassian flinched. Richard pressed his advantage. "You trusted the wrong person, Cassian. That's all. You gave power to someone who didn't deserve it, but you're using that as an excuse to shut out everyone, including the one person who actually does deserve your trust. She ended it, not me. She's the one who said it was over. Because you proved her right." Richard's voice rose. "You left her the moment things got difficult, exactly like she knew you would. And instead of fighting for her, instead of finding a way to handle this crisis without abandoning your marriage, you did exactly what you've always done. You chose the easy path. There's nothing easy about this, isn't there? Emotions are hard. Vulnerability is terrifying. Actually changing the fundamental patterns of your behavior requires constant effort and uncomfortable self-examination. But diving back into work? Losing yourself in crisis management? That's comfortable. That's familiar. That's easy." The words hit like physical blows. Cassian sank into his chair. Exhaustion and anger and grief all crashing down at once. "I don't know how to do both." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to save my estate and save my marriage. I'm not strong enough." "Then get stronger." "How?" "By admitting you need help." Richard sat down across from him. "You've spent your entire life believing you have to do everything alone, that asking for assistance is weakness. But that's not strength, Cassian. That's fear. Real strength is building a team you can trust, delegating, letting other people carry part of the burden. I tried that. Brennan was part of that team, and he betrayed you. So you fire him, prosecute him, and find someone better. But you don't abandon the entire concept of trust because one person abused it." Cassian rubbed his face. "I've already lost her." "Have you?" Richard leaned forward. "Or have you just convinced yourself you have because it's easier than fighting for her?" She said it was over, and you believed her. Without question, without argument. You just accepted it and left. Which tells me you wanted to believe it, because staying and fighting would have required you to actually change, to prove you could handle crisis without disappearing, to be uncomfortable and uncertain and scared. I am scared. Then say that to her. Stop hiding behind work and control and tell her the truth. That you're terrified, that you don't know how to do this, that you're going to mess up and probably disappoint her again, but that you love her anyway and you're willing to keep trying. Cassian looked at the man who'd become something like a father to him over these past weeks. What if it's too late? Then at least you'll know you fought for it. But Cassian, Richard's expression was serious. If you let her go without a fight, if you retreat back into this fortress and convince yourself it was inevitable, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Because she's the best thing that ever happened to you. And you know it. Cassian didn't sleep that night. He paced his chambers until dawn, Richard's words echoing in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Leora's face. The devastation when he'd hesitated. The resignation when she'd ended it. The truth he'd been too cowardly to say. Around 4 a.m, something shifted. He'd been looking at this all wrong, treating it like a binary choice. Estate or marriage, control or vulnerability. The ruthless duke or the devoted husband. But what if it wasn't either or? What if the real test was learning to integrate both? To be effective and emotional. To manage his empire without sacrificing his humanity. Brennan's betrayal wasn't punishment for being vulnerable. It was a consequence of blind trust. Of giving someone power without proper oversight. Of being so focused on maintaining control over his emotions that he'd neglected actual accountability. The solution wasn't to shut down again. It was to build better systems, to delegate with supervision, to trust but verify, to be smart about vulnerability instead of abandoning it entirely. At dawn, Cassian called an emergency meeting. The estate managers assembled, bleary-eyed and confused. Cassian stood at the head of the table, looking more composed than he had in days. New protocols, he said. Every financial transaction over £10,000 requires dual sign-off, monthly third-party audits, quarterly reviews with the full management team. No one person has total access to our accounts. Ever. Hendricks nodded. That's sensible, Your Grace. Should have been in place years ago. You're right. It should have. I trusted when I should have verified. That stops now. He moved to the next item. I'm hiring a chief operating officer. Someone who reports directly to me but has authority to make day-to-day decisions in my absence. I want candidates vetted by next week. The managers exchanged glances. Your Grace, that's quite a delegation of power. Which is exactly why it needs to happen. I can't micromanage every detail anymore. It's not sustainable. I need people I can trust to handle operations while I focus on strategy. And family. The last word hung in the air. Whitmore spoke carefully. Is the Duchess returning to Ravenhold? Cassian met his eyes. I don't know. But whether she does or not, I'm not disappearing into work anymore. These new systems need to function without my constant presence. Build them accordingly. For the first time since returning, Cassian felt like he could breathe. This was the answer. Not choosing between his responsibilities, but restructuring them so they didn't require his complete sacrifice. Building an empire that could function without consuming him entirely, leaving space for the things that actually mattered. Mom. 5 days after leaving the Ashbourne estate, Cassian wrote a letter. Not a formal apology, not a desperate plea, just the truth. Leora, you were right about everything. I can't be two different people. The vulnerable husband and the ruthless duke. But I've been going about this all wrong. I've been trying to transform from one into the other when what I really need is to integrate both. Brennan's betrayal showed me something I should have learned years ago. Control isn't strength, systems are. Trusting the right people and building proper oversight is smarter than trying to manage everything myself. I've spent the past week restructuring how the estate operates, hiring managers, implementing checks and balances, creating systems that don't require my constant presence to function. Not because I'm abandoning my responsibilities, but because I'm finally learning to fulfill them intelligently. Here's what I'm asking. Let me prove I can do both. Let me show you that I can manage an empire and still make you my priority. Not by neglecting one for the other, but by being smarter about how I approach both. I'm not saying it will be perfect. I'll still mess up, still have moments where I retreat into old patterns, still disappoint you in ways I can't predict. But I'm learning, actually learning, not just performing change, but fundamentally reconstructing how I live. If you're willing to give me another chance, I'll be at the garden fountain in your family's estate on Saturday at noon, the same place where you asked me if I loved you enough to be destroyed by losing you. The answer is yes. I do, I am, and I'm done running from that truth. Cassian? He sealed his letter and sent it immediately, before he could second-guess himself, before fear could convince him to add qualifications or hedge his bets. Now he just had to wait, and hope she'd show up. Saturday arrived with agonizing slowness. Cassian rode to the Ashbourne estate, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in any business negotiation or political confrontation. This was a different kind of risk, one where he had no leverage, no control, no way to guarantee the outcome. He arrived at the fountain at 11:45. Early, but he couldn't stand to wait any longer. The garden was empty, quiet except for birds and the gentle sound of water. Cassian sat on the stone bench and tried to breathe normally. She might not come, had every right not to. He'd hurt her too many times, disappointed her too consistently, given her too much evidence that he'd never actually change. But God, he hoped she'd give him one more chance. Noon came, then 12:05, 12:10. At 12:15, Cassian started to accept that she wasn't coming. At 12:17, he heard footsteps on the gravel path. She appeared around a hedge, and Cassian's breath caught. She looked different, harder. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. But she was there. She'd come. That had to mean something. Leora stopped a few feet away. Didn't sit down, just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You came," Cassian said. "I almost didn't. What changed your mind?" "Your letter." She moved slightly closer. It was different from the others. More honest, less about promising to change and more about actually describing how. "I meant every word." "I know. That's what scares me." They stood in the silence of the garden. The fountain burbled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. "I've been thinking," Leora said finally, "about what you said, about integrating instead of choosing. And I realized I've been doing the same thing. Treating it like you have to be either the Duke or my husband, either powerful or vulnerable, either in control or in love. But that's not realistic. No, it's not." She sat down on the bench, not next to him, on the opposite end. "I can't ask you to abandon your responsibilities. That's not fair. And honestly, the man I fell in love with at that dinner wasn't just handsome and charming. He was powerful, capable, someone who could command a room with his presence. I don't want you to stop being that person." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to be that person without losing yourself in it. I want you to manage your empire without disappearing into it. I want you to be the Duke who can make hard decisions and the husband who comes home at night and actually sees me. That's what I'm trying to build." "I know." She looked at him directly. "And I want to believe you can do it. But I'm terrified, Cassian. Terrified that I'm going to trust you again. And 6 months from now, we'll be right back where we started. So we build in safeguards." "What?" Cassian shifted to face her more fully. "You said it yourself. We need systems. Structure. Not the kind that stifles us, but the kind that keeps us accountable. So let's build them together. Like what? Like mandatory dinner together. 4 nights a week. No exceptions unless one of us is traveling. Like weekly walks where we talk about how we're actually doing, not just what needs to be managed. Like a rule that neither of us goes more than 3 days without substantive communication if we're apart." Leora's expression shifted. "You've been thinking about this." "Constantly. I've been restructuring my entire approach to the estate, building systems so it doesn't require constant presence. Hiring people I can trust but with actual oversight. Creating space in my life that isn't consumed by work." "Why?" "Because I finally understand what I was too blind to see before. Power without connection is just isolation wearing a crown. And I'd rather have you and struggle with balance than have total control and be completely alone." Tears gathered in her eyes. "That's what I needed to hear 3 years ago. I know. And I can't get that time back. Can't undo the damage I did. But I can spend the rest of our lives making sure you never doubt your importance to me again." Leora was quiet for a long moment. Then she moved, closed the distance between them on the bench, took his hand. I'm still angry at you, I know. And I'm not ready to come back to Ravenhold yet. Okay, but I'm willing to try again. Really try. Not just test you to see when you'll fail, but actually work on building something sustainable. Cassian felt something in his chest unclench. That's all I'm asking for. She leaned her head on his shoulder. What if we can't do it? What if we try and the demands of your position are just too much? What if I'm asking for something impossible? Then we'll figure that out together. And if it truly is impossible, if we reach a point where we genuinely can't make both work, we'll make that decision as partners, not as strangers who stopped communicating years ago. Partners. Equals. She lifted her head to look at him. I like the sound of that. So do I. They sat together as the afternoon sun painted the garden gold. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, wasn't everything magically fixed, but it was honest, real. Two damaged people choosing to keep trying despite all the evidence that it might not work. That was more valuable than any guarantee. After a while, Leora spoke again. I heard about Brennan, about the full extent of the theft. 700,000 pounds. Are you going to be all right, financially? Yes. It's a significant loss, but not catastrophic. We'll recover. Cassian squeezed her hand. Your financial security is tied to mine, whether we're living together or not. This affects you too. I hadn't thought about that. I have. Which is why part of the restructuring includes better oversight, better systems. Making sure this can never happen again. Good. She was quiet for a moment. Have they found him yet? No. But they will. And when they do, criminal prosecution, civil suit, full recovery of whatever assets we can locate. Nothing more? Cassian understood what she was asking. In the old days, he would have made Brennan's life a living hell, would have destroyed his family, made his betrayal so publicly painful that it served as a warning to anyone who might consider crossing him. But that was the old way, the brutal way, the way that prioritized fear over justice. Nothing more, he confirmed. I'll pursue legal remedies, but I'm not interested in vengeance, just accountability. Leora looked at him with something like approval. You really are changing. I'm trying. Every day. She kissed his cheek, soft, brief, but genuine. Keep trying. I will. And Cassian, yes? Thank you. For coming here, for fighting for this, for not giving up even when I told you it was over. You're worth fighting for. So are you. They decided Leora would stay at her family's estate for another month, not as separation, but as transition. Time to make sure Cassian's new systems actually worked before she returned to Ravenhold. Time to build trust gradually instead of rushing back into proximity. Cassian returned to his estate with a lighter heart but heavier responsibilities. The restructuring was massive, hiring new managers, implementing oversight protocols, training staff on the new systems. It was exhausting, but for the first time he wasn't doing it alone. He'd assembled a team, actually trusted them, delegated real authority, and discovered that the estate ran more smoothly when he wasn't trying to micromanage every detail. He wrote to Leora every other day, not formal letters, but honest ones, telling her about the challenges, the small victories, the moments when he wanted to retreat into old patterns, and the way he was learning to resist that urge. She wrote back, sometimes encouraging, sometimes challenging him on things that sounded like backsliding, sometimes just sharing her own day. They were building something new, not the cold distance of their first marriage, not the intense courtship of their reconciliation attempt, something in between, sustainable, real. A month passed, then 6 weeks. On a Friday evening, Cassian received a letter that made his heart stop. I'm ready to come home. Leora returned to Ravenhold on a Tuesday afternoon. Cassian was waiting in the drive when her carriage arrived. He'd wanted to ride out to meet her halfway, but had restrained himself, giving her space, letting her come to him. She stepped out of the carriage, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then she smiled, and Cassian knew they were going to be all right. Not perfect, not without struggle, but all right. Welcome home, he said. It's good to be home. She took his offered hand. Show me what you've changed. He did. walked her through the castle, pointing out all the small differences. The music room where a piano now sat open and ready. The breakfast room set for two. The study where he'd hung the watercolors from her chambers. And in their bedroom, not his chambers, their shared space, he'd had the staff create something entirely new. Warm colors, comfortable furniture, a sitting area by the window where she could read, a desk for her correspondence, space for both of them. Leora stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. You remembered. Everything I wanted, everything I tried to create before. I remembered, and I'm sorry it took me 3 years to actually see it. She turned to him. So what happens now? Now we start living. Really living together. And when you have a crisis, we handle it together. I don't disappear. I don't shut you out. I communicate. And when I'm struggling, you tell me. We talk about it. We figure it out. Can it really be that simple? Cassian pulled her close. No. It'll be complicated and messy, and we'll have fights and setbacks and moments when we both want to give up. But we'll do it together. And that makes all the difference. She rested her head against his chest. I love you, Cassian Vale. I love you too, Leora Vale. Always have. I was just too afraid to admit it. They stood in their new bedroom, in their new life, and felt the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because real life doesn't end. It continues, evolves, demands constant work and attention and care. But for the first time in their marriage, they were facing it together. And that was enough. 3 months later, everything fell apart again. Cassian was in a meeting with his new chief operating officer when Whitmore burst in without knocking. His face was white. Your Grace, your presence is required immediately. In your private study. I'm in the middle of... Now, Your Grace. The urgency in Whitmore's voice killed any protest. Cassian excused himself and followed the steward through the corridors. When they reached the study, Richard Ashbourne was waiting, along with 2 men Cassian didn't recognize. Well-dressed, official-looking. What's going on? Richard's expression was grim. These gentlemen are from the Crown Prosecutor's office. They need to speak with you about Marcus Brennan. We found him, one of the men said. In France. But when we went to arrest him, he made certain claims. Claims that require investigation. What kind of claims? The prosecutor pulled out a folder, opened it, showed Cassian a series of documents. Bank statements, transfer records, all dated from 3 years ago. All showing payments from Cassian's personal accounts to shell companies Brennan controlled. Brennan claims you were complicit in the embezzlement, that the money was being moved offshore to avoid taxation, that you authorized every transaction and are now using him as a scapegoat. The room tilted sideways. That's insane. I never authorized any of these transfers. I didn't even know about them until... The transfers are from your personal account, Your Grace, with your signature. The second prosecutor stepped forward. We're going to need you to come with us for questioning. Am I being arrested? Not yet, but we need to determine the veracity of Mr. Brennan's claims, and that requires a formal interview. Cassian looked at Richard. The older man's face was stone. This is absurd. I'm the victim here. Then you have nothing to worry about. The prosecutor's tone suggested otherwise. Shall we go? Dimatkin. Cassian spent 6 hours in a Crown office answering questions. The same questions over and over. Did you authorize these transfers? Were you aware of the offshore accounts? Did you instruct Brennan to hide assets from taxation? No. 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 But his signature was on the documents. His account had made the transfers. And Brennan had detailed records of meetings, conversations, instructions that Cassian supposedly gave. It was a masterpiece of false evidence. Years in the making, a trap so carefully constructed that Cassian walked into it without ever seeing the jaws closing. By the time they released him, without charges but under investigation, it was nearly midnight. Richard was waiting outside. So was Leora. She looked terrified. Tell me this isn't real, she said. It's not. I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any of this, but your signature is forged. Has to be. Brennan had access to all my documents. He could have created whatever evidence he needed. Richard's expression was dark. This is worse than embezzlement. If the Crown believes you were evading taxation, they can seize everything. The estates, the investments, all of it. I know. And your reputation will be destroyed. I know that too. They stood on the steps of the government building. Behind them, the city lights twinkled. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that Cassian's entire world was crashing down. Again. But this time, when he looked at Leora, he didn't see blame. Didn't see regret. He saw partnership. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. "Together." And Cassian realized that for the first time in his life, he actually believed it. Not because the crisis was manageable, but because he wasn't facing it alone. The ruthless Duke had finally learned the most dangerous lesson of all. True power wasn't control. It was trust. And that realization was about to be tested in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The carriage ride back to Ravenhold was silent. Not the comfortable silence they'd been building over the past months. This was different. Heavy. Suffocating. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest until breathing becomes a conscious effort. Cassian stared out the window at the darkness rushing past. His mind was already racing through scenarios, calculating angles, strategizing responses. 6 hours of interrogation had revealed the depth of Brennan's planning. The man hadn't just stolen money. He'd constructed an elaborate framework of false evidence designed to implicate Cassian in tax evasion, money laundering, possibly even treason if the prosecutors could connect the offshore accounts to foreign powers. It was brilliant, devastating, and almost impossible to disprove without the kind of time Cassian didn't have. Leora's hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers were cold. "Talk to me." Cassian turned from the window. Even in the dim light, he could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him. Fear for him. "It's bad. Worse than I initially thought. Brennan's been building this case for years. Every signature is perfect. Every transaction looks legitimate on paper. And he's claiming I orchestrated everything to hide assets from the crown. Can you prove you didn't? That's the problem. Proving a negative is nearly impossible. I'd need to demonstrate that every signature was forged, that every meeting he claims happened didn't, that every instruction he says I gave was fabricated. And that requires time and resources I don't have. What happens if you can't prove it?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. "They could strip everything. The titles, the estates, the fortune, all of it. And I could face criminal charges, prison, potentially." Leora's grip tightened. "We won't let that happen." The certainty in her voice made something crack in his chest. Here's what people misunderstand about power. They think it's about dominance, about making others submit, about standing alone at the top of the hierarchy and controlling everything beneath you. But that's not power. That's just isolation wearing a crown. Real power is having someone look at you when everything is falling apart and say "we" with absolute conviction. Having a partner who sees you at your lowest and doesn't run, who stands beside you when standing beside you might cost them everything. Cassian had spent his whole life avoiding that kind of power because he thought it made you weak. Now, holding Leora's hand in the darkness, he realized it was the only thing that made you strong enough to survive. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Okay. If this goes the way I think it will, if the Crown decides to prosecute, they'll come after you too. You're my wife. They'll come after. Your assets are legally tied to mine. They'll freeze everything, seize properties, make your life hell. So we'll face it together." "No." Cassian turned to face her fully. "I need you to file for separation of assets. Distance yourself legally. Protect what's yours before they can touch it." Leora pulled her hand away. "Absolutely not." "Leora, I said no." Her voice was steel. "I'm not abandoning you the moment things get difficult. That's what you did to me, remember? And it almost destroyed us. I'm not making that same mistake. This is different. This is about protecting you. From what? Financial ruin? Social disgrace?" She leaned closer. "I don't care about any of that. I care about you. And I'm not going to stand by and watch you face this alone because you're too proud or too protective or too damaged to accept help. You don't understand what you're risking." "Don't I?" Leora's eyes flashed. "I'm risking exactly what you risked when you came to my family's estate. Everything. My reputation, my security, my future. And I'm doing it for the same reason you did, because you're worth it." The carriage hit a bump. They swayed together, then apart. Outside, Ravenhold's gates appeared in the distance. Cassian felt something fundamental shift inside him. All his life, he'd been trained to bear burdens alone, to see asking for help as weakness, to believe that true strength meant never needing anyone. But Leora was offering him something different. Not to take the burden from him, but to share it, to stand beside him and carry half the weight so neither of them collapsed under it. That was terrifying, and also the only thing that might actually save him. "All right," he said finally, "together. Together." They rode through the gates of Ravenhold as partners, as equals, as two people about to face the fight of their lives with nothing but each other and the fragile trust they'd built. It would have to be enough. The War Council assembled at dawn. Cassian's study was crowded with the best legal minds money could hire. 3 solicitors, 2 barristers, a former Crown prosecutor who'd gone into private practice. All of them looked grim as they reviewed the evidence against him. Richard Ashbourne sat in the corner, his presence both moral support and strategic advisor. Leora stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching everything with sharp attention. The lead barrister, a man named Cromwell with a reputation for winning impossible cases, laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "The evidence is damning, Your Grace. Brennan has documentation spanning 3 years, bank transfers with your signature, meeting notes with your seal, even letters in your handwriting discussing offshore strategies. If even half of this is authentic, you're facing serious criminal charges." "It's not authentic. None of it is. Can you prove that?" Cassian stared at the document spread across his desk. His signature was perfect on every page. Better than perfect. Identical. Which was impossible unless Brennan had somehow developed supernatural penmanship or access to some kind of mechanical reproduction. "The signatures are too perfect," he said slowly. "Human handwriting has variation. Pressure differences. Slight tremors. These are identical down to the microscopic level." Cromwell leaned forward. "You're suggesting forgery via mechanical means? I'm suggesting Brennan had access to my signature stamp, the one I used for routine correspondence. He could have created these documents any time in the past 3 years, and I wouldn't have known until it was too late. That's a theory, but proving it requires forensic analysis, time we don't have. Then we make time." Cassian stood. "File for continuance, delay the prosecution, give us space to conduct our own investigation. They won't grant it. Not for something this serious. They will if we give them reason to doubt Brennan's credibility." He turned to one of the solicitors. "What do we know about Brennan's current situation? Where he's staying? Who he's been in contact with?" The solicitor shuffled through papers. "He's in Paris, staying at a moderately expensive hotel. No extravagant purchases that we can trace. Which is odd, considering he supposedly has £700,000, because he doesn't have it anymore." Cassian's mind was racing now, connecting pieces. He spent it, or moved it, or gave it to someone else. Find the money trail. "Where did it go after he transferred it out of my accounts?" "We've been trying. The accounts are buried in shell companies across 4 countries. Try harder. And focus on the timing. When did the transfers happen relative to when he created this false evidence? There has to be a pattern." Leora spoke from the window. "What if he never intended to keep the money?" Everyone turned to look at her. She moved into the room, her expression thoughtful. "You're all assuming Brennan stole the money for himself. But what if that wasn't the goal? What if the theft was just the mechanism to create evidence against Cassian?" "That makes no sense," one of the solicitors said. "Why steal £700,000 if you're not keeping it?" "To make the crime look real." Leora looked at Cassian. "Think about it. If Brennan just created false documents claiming you evaded taxes, the Crown would investigate and probably find nothing. But if he actually moved the money, created a real crime you'd have to explain, then the false documents become supporting evidence for something that genuinely happened." Cassian felt electricity run through him. "You're saying he sacrificed the money to build a credible frame. I'm saying maybe someone paid him to do this, paid him more than £700,000 to destroy you." The room went silent. Richard spoke up from his corner. "She's right. This is too elaborate for simple revenge. Brennan's risking his life and freedom. He wouldn't do that just for money. He's not even keeping." "Someone wanted you destroyed, Cassian. And they paid Brennan to build the mechanism." "Who?" Cassian's voice was cold. "Who has both the motive and the resources to orchestrate something this complex?" Cromwell pulled out another file. "We've been compiling a list of your enemies, business rivals, political opponents, families you've displaced in various transactions over the years. It's extensive. Narrow it down. Who's made moves recently? Acquired properties? Consolidated power? Someone's been positioning themselves to fill the vacuum my destruction would create. The solicitors exchanged glances, started pulling additional documents, and Cassian stood in the center of his study, surrounded by evidence of his impending destruction, and felt something dangerous awaken inside him. Someone had tried to take everything from him: his fortune, his reputation, his freedom. They'd weaponized his own trusted advisor against him and built a trap so perfect it seemed impossible to escape. They'd forgotten one critical detail. Cassian Vale had spent his entire life fighting, not with fists or weapons, but with intelligence and strategy and absolute ruthlessness when necessary. And now, for the first time, he had something worth fighting for beyond just his empire. He had Leora. He had Richard. He had people who believed in him. And he was about to show whoever orchestrated this exactly what happened when you cornered the ruthless Duke and gave him nothing left to lose. Quotes. The investigation took 72 hours of non-stop work. Teams of accountants traced money flows across international borders. Handwriting experts analyzed the forged signatures. Private investigators dug into Brennan's communications, his associates, his movements over the past 3 years. Cassian barely slept, barely ate. He operated on coffee and fury and the kind of focused intensity that had built his empire in the first place. But this time, he wasn't alone. Leora worked beside him, managing the solicitors, coordinating the investigators, handling the social pressures that came with being the wife of a duke under investigation. She was magnificent, sharp and efficient, and absolutely unwavering in her support. Richard used his political connections to slow the prosecution, called in favors, made subtle threats, bought them precious days. And on the third night, they found it. The connection. One of the investigators burst into the study at 2 a.m, wild-eyed and exhausted. Lord Pemberton. It's Pemberton. Cassian looked up from the financial documents he'd been reviewing. What about him? This investigator spread out new papers. He's been acquiring your former properties, the ones Brennan sold at below-market rates to shell companies. We traced the ownership. The shell companies all lead back to a holding firm Pemberton controls. That's not enough. Plenty of investors buy distressed properties. But wait, there's more. The investigator pulled out bank records. 3 weeks before Brennan disappeared, Pemberton made a payment of £800,000 to an offshore account, same account that later paid Brennan's legal fees in France. Cassian went very still. Pemberton paid Brennan to frame you, to steal your money and create evidence of tax evasion, to destroy your reputation so thoroughly that your remaining properties would lose value. Properties Pemberton could then acquire for pennies on the pound. It was perfect, elegant, exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking Cassian himself would have employed. Pemberton had studied him, learned from him, and then used those same tactics to destroy him. The bastard. Can we prove this? Cassian's voice was ice. The bank records are solid. The property transfers are documented. We can build a case. How long? Weeks? Maybe months. We need to untangle the corporate structure, establish the timeline, connect all the pieces in a way that holds up in court. We don't have weeks. Leora had been listening from her chair by the fireplace. Then we don't use the courts. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood up, moving into the circle of lamplight. Pemberton thinks he's won. He's waiting for the crown to prosecute you, destroy your reputation, force you to sell your remaining assets at desperation prices. He's playing a long game. So we changed the game. Cassian understood immediately. Force him into a mistake, exactly. Leora looked at the investigators. Can you get word to Brennan? Anonymously? Probably. Why? Because if Brennan thinks Pemberton is about to betray him, he'll panic. He might do something stupid, something we can use. Richard smiled from his corner. I knew I liked you for a reason. The trap was simple. They leaked information through carefully chosen channels. Rumors that the Crown was investigating not just Cassian, but also the shell companies that had purchased his properties. That they were looking into whether Pemberton had engaged in fraud or collusion with Brennan. None of it was true. But Brennan didn't know that. Within 48 hours, he made contact, not with Pemberton, with one of Cassian's former business associates trying to negotiate immunity in exchange for testimony against both Cassian and Pemberton. The associate immediately informed Cassian's team, and they had him. Brennan was willing to betray Pemberton to save himself, which meant he had evidence, records, communications, proof of the conspiracy. Cromwell worked through the night negotiating with Brennan's French attorney. By dawn, they had an agreement. Full immunity for Brennan in exchange for complete cooperation. All the evidence he had. All the communications with Pemberton. Everything. When Cassian saw the documents, he wanted to destroy something. Emails spanning 2 years. Detailed plans. Pemberton had orchestrated every aspect. The embezzlement, the forgeries, the offshore accounts. All designed to frame Cassian while enriching Pemberton. And the motive was simple. Jealousy. Pure, petty jealousy. Pemberton had spent his entire life in Cassian's shadow, second best at everything, and he'd finally decided to stop competing and start destroying. "We have him," Cromwell said. "This is enough to clear you completely, enough to prosecute Pemberton for fraud, conspiracy, possibly even treason depending on how the Crown wants to interpret the offshore money movements." Cassian stared at the evidence, felt the rage burning in his chest, the desire to utterly annihilate Pemberton. To use every weapon at his disposal to make the man suffer. It would be easy. Justified, even. Pemberton had tried to destroy him. Turnabout was more than fair play, but then Leora's hand touched his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the old me, the one who would have made Pemberton's destruction so complete and so public that it would serve as a warning to anyone who ever considered crossing me. And the new you? The new me is trying to figure out if there's a better way." There was silence in the study, everyone waiting to see which version of the Duke would emerge. Cassian took a breath, made his choice. "We give everything to the Crown. Let them prosecute Pemberton through proper channels. We clear my name, recover what assets we can, and we move on." Richard raised an eyebrow. "No vengeance?" "No vengeance. Justice." "There's a difference. When did you get so noble?" Cassian looked at Leora. "When I finally found something more important than revenge." Mamashek. The Crown prosecutor arrived at Ravenhold 3 days later. Cassian presented the evidence in the same study where he'd been interrogated about his supposed crimes. The same prosecutors who'd treated him like a criminal now stared at documents proving his innocence and Pemberton's guilt. The lead prosecutor's face went through several shades of pale. "This is comprehensive. It's everything you need." Cassian's voice was controlled. "Brennan's testimony, financial records, communications, a complete picture of the conspiracy. Lord Pemberton will dispute this. Of course he will. But the evidence speaks for itself. The prosecutor gathered the documents carefully. We'll need to verify everything, conduct our own investigation. But if this holds up, all charges against you will be dropped, and Lord Pemberton will face the consequences of his actions." "How long?" "The verification process? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. "And my reputation in the meantime?" The prosecutor had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm afraid that's beyond our control, Your Grace. Society makes its own judgments." "Yes, it does." After they left, Cassian stood at the window watching their carriage disappear down the drive. 2 weeks of being a suspected criminal while the Crown verified what he already knew to be true. 2 weeks of whispers and speculation and social exile. The old Cassian would have raged against the injustice, would have used every connection to force faster action, would have made someone pay for the indignity. The new Cassian just felt tired. "You should rest," Leora said from behind him. "Can't. Too much to do." "Cassian." She moved to stand beside him. "We won. The evidence is solid. You'll be cleared. It's over." "Is it?" He turned to face her. "Pemberton's going to fight this. He has resources, connections. He'll drag it out as long as possible. And even when it's finally settled, there will always be people who wonder if I was actually guilty, if I just bought my way out of trouble. So we prove them wrong. We rebuild. We move forward." "How?" "The same way we've been doing everything else. Together. One day at a time." Cassian pulled her close, pressed his face into her hair, breathed in the scent that had become home. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway." They stood together in the late afternoon light, Two people who'd been broken and had somehow found a way to build something stronger from the pieces. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. The verification process took exactly 17 days. 17 days of social purgatory. Invitations withdrawn. Friends suddenly unavailable. The kind of polite ostracism that aristocracy specialized in. Cassian handled it with outward composure. Attended to estate business. Worked on the new management systems. Pretended he didn't notice the way people crossed the street to avoid him. But at night, alone with Leora, he let the mask slip. They think I did it. No matter what the evidence says, there will always be doubt. Let them think what they want. We know the truth. Does that matter? If society believes I'm a criminal, only if you let it. Leora took his face in her hands. Your worth isn't determined by what other people think. It's determined by who you choose to be. And I've watched you choose honor over vengeance, partnership over control, trust over isolation. That's who you are. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth your concern. You're very wise. I'm very stubborn. There's a difference. On the 17th day, the Crown made its announcement. All charges against Cassian Vale, Duke of Ravenhold, were dropped. The evidence conclusively demonstrated his innocence. Furthermore, Lord Pemberton was being formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. The reversal was immediate and complete. Invitations reappeared. Apologies arrived by the dozen. Society rushed to welcome back the Duke they'd been so quick to condemn. Cassian burned most of the letters without reading them. Hypocrites, he muttered. Leora watched him feed another envelope into the fireplace. You're angry. Shouldn't I be? These same people were ready to destroy me based on rumors. Now they want to pretend nothing happened. So punish them. Refuse their invitations. Cut them from your social circle. Make them feel the consequences of their fickleness. Cassian was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. No, that's the old way. The controlling way. I'm not interested in revenge against people who don't matter. Who does matter? You. Richard and Catherine. The staff who stayed loyal. The tenants who never doubted. Those are the people I care about. The rest can think whatever they want. Leora smiled. Look at you. Growing as a person. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm proud. That night they received an unexpected visitor. Pemberton. He arrived in a hired carriage, no servants, no pretense, just a broken man in expensive clothes coming to face the consequences of his actions. Whitmore announced him with barely concealed disgust. Lord Pemberton requests an audience, Your Grace. Cassian was inclined to refuse, to let the man stew in his own failures without the satisfaction of a final confrontation. But Leora touched his arm. Hear him out. You might regret it if you don't. So Cassian received him in the formal drawing room, the same room where he'd once entertained Pemberton as an equal, where they'd discussed business and politics and pretended to be friends. Pemberton looked terrible, aged 10 years in the 3 weeks since his arrest. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes were hollow. He looked like a man who'd gambled everything and lost. They stared at each other across the elegant space. Finally, Pemberton spoke. I came to apologize. Cassian said nothing, just waited. I was jealous. Pemberton's voice was raw. Of everything you had, your wealth, your power, your position. I spent my entire life trying to match you and always falling short. And I convinced myself that you didn't deserve it, that you'd been lucky, that if circumstances were different, I'd be the one on top and you'd be the one struggling. Cassian's expression remained neutral. So you decided to take what you couldn't earn? Yes. Pemberton looked down at his hands. I hired Brennan, planned the whole thing, thought I was being clever, strategic. I told myself it was just business, that you'd do the same in my position. Would I have? The question hung between them. Pemberton looked up. 3 years ago? Yes. You would have destroyed anyone who stood between you and what you wanted. But now? The man who just cleared his name and chose to prosecute me through proper channels instead of destroying my family. I don't know that person. And I'm not sure you do either. Cassian felt something shift in his chest. You're right. I don't know this person. I'm still figuring out who he is. Whoever he is, Pemberton said quietly. He's better than both of us used to be. I'm going to prison. My family will lose everything. My reputation is destroyed, and I deserve every bit of it. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for what I did. for what I tried to do, for being too small and too bitter to see that you were changing into something worth respecting. Cassian studied the man who tried to destroy him, felt the anger, the desire for more vengeance, the urge to kick Pemberton while he was down and make sure he never got up. And then he let it go. Your apology doesn't change anything. You'll still face justice, still lose everything you conspired to steal from me, but I accept it. Not for your sake, for mine. Because I'm done carrying rage around like armor. Pemberton nodded slowly. That's more grace than I deserve. Yes, it is. The former lord stood, moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, your wife is extraordinary. Hold on to her. She's what we all wish we were smart enough to find. I know. After Pemberton left, Leora emerged from where she'd been listening in the adjacent room. That was generous of you, was it? I still think he's a bastard who deserves everything coming to him. But you didn't twist the knife. Didn't make it worse. That's growth, or exhaustion. I'm too tired to maintain that level of hatred. She kissed his cheek. I'll take exhausted and humane over energetic and cruel any day. The trial was set for 3 months later. In the meantime, Cassian focused on rebuilding, not just his reputation or his fortune, but his entire approach to life. He restructured the estate management with real oversight, hired a chief operating officer who reported to a board that included Richard, implemented checks and balances that made another Brennan impossible. He attended social events with Leora, not to prove anything to society, but because she enjoyed them, learned to dance properly, had actual conversations with people he'd previously dismissed as irrelevant. He discovered he enjoyed parts of it, the human connection, the small moments of genuine interaction. But he also learned that some things didn't change. He was still ruthless in business negotiations, still commanded rooms with his presence, still made decisions with the kind of absolute certainty that came from decades of leadership. The difference was now he came home at night, sat down to dinner with his wife, talked about the day, shared the burden instead of carrying it alone. And slowly, painfully, he began to trust that it would last, that the changes he'd made were real, that he could be both the Duke and the husband without sacrificing either. 2 weeks before the trial, Leora made an announcement at breakfast. I'm pregnant. Cassian dropped his fork. The clatter on the china plate seemed impossibly loud. You're what? Pregnant, with child. Expecting. She was smiling, but her eyes were nervous. I saw the physician yesterday. He confirmed it. Cassian stood up so fast his chair fell backward, crossed to her side of the table, pulled her into his arms. Are you happy? She whispered against his chest. Happy. He laughed. It came out shaky, almost broken. I'm terrified, overwhelmed, completely unprepared, and yes, unbelievably happy. Good. Because we're doing this. Together. Together. He held her while his mind raced through implications. A child. An heir. Someone who would depend on him completely. Someone he could damage the way his own father had damaged him. The fear was enormous. But so was the determination not to repeat the pattern. To be better. To give his child what he'd never had. A father who was present, engaged. Capable of showing love without seeing it as weakness. I'm going to mess this up, he said quietly. Probably. Leora pulled back to look at him. We both will. But we'll mess it up together and figure it out as we go. That's not very reassuring. It's honest. That's better. He kissed her then, properly, with all the emotion he'd spent so long suppressing, relief and joy and terror and love all mixed together into something too big for words. When they finally broke apart, Leora was crying. Happy tears. The kind Cassian was learning to recognize and value. Our child is going to have 2 very damaged parents. Yes. But 2 parents who love each other, who chose to stay and fight for their marriage instead of running away. That's worth something. It's worth everything. The trial began on a cold February morning. The courtroom was packed, aristocracy and commoners alike, all desperate to witness the fall of Lord Pemberton. Cassian sat in the gallery with Leora beside him, her hand in his, watching the prosecution systematically destroy the man who'd tried to destroy them. Brennan testified for 3 days, laid out the entire conspiracy in excruciating detail, how Pemberton had approached him, The planning, the execution, the payments. It was damning, complete, indefensible. Pemberton's attorneys tried to claim he'd been deceived by Brennan, that he'd believed the investments were legitimate, that he had no knowledge of the forgeries or the frame. No one believed them. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, forfeiture of all assets acquired through the conspiracy, public disgrace. Pemberton showed no emotion as the sentence was read, just stood there like a man who'd already accepted his fate. As the guards led him away, he looked at Cassian one last time. No pleading, no anger, just acknowledgement. One man to another. You won. Cassian didn't respond. Just watched him disappear through the doorway into a future of iron bars and regret. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Questions shouted from every direction. How did it feel to be vindicated? Would he seek civil damages? Did he have anything to say about Pemberton's conviction? Cassian raised a hand for silence. Got it immediately. Even in disgrace and restoration, he commanded attention. Justice has been served. That's all I have to say, but, Your Grace, what about... That's all. He walked to his carriage with Leora on his arm. Climbed in. Let the door close on the chaos. As they pulled away, Leora squeezed his hand. How do you feel? Cassian considered the question. Honest answer? Empty. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated. But mostly I just feel tired. That's because revenge doesn't actually satisfy. It just exhausts. So what does satisfy? This. She placed his hand on her stomach where their child was growing, building something instead of destroying it, creating a future instead of avenging the past. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You were just too stubborn to listen. He laughed. Fair point. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then Cassian spoke again. I want to do something different. Different how? I want to use the recovered assets, not to rebuild my fortune, but to create something lasting, a foundation, for education, for tenant welfare, for people who don't have the advantages we have. Leora turned to look at him. You're serious? Completely. I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth and power. And in the end, none of it protected me from Pemberton. None of it actually mattered. But you know what did matter? The people who stood by me. Richard. The staff. You. I want to build something that honors that creates more of that in the world. Her eyes filled with tears. I love you so much. I love you too. And Cassian meant it. Not as a strategy or a manipulation or even just as words. He meant it with every fiber of his being. This woman who'd fought for him when everyone else was ready to condemn. Who'd seen him at his absolute worst and chosen to stay anyway. Who was carrying his child and building a future with him despite every reason to run. She was his partner, his equal, his everything. The carriage pulled through Ravenhold's gates. Home. Not the cold fortress it had been, but a real home. Warm, alive, full of possibility. They climbed the steps together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Because they'd learned the most important lesson. Power wasn't about control, it was about connection, and together they were unstoppable. But that night, as Cassian was reviewing the foundation documents in his study, Whitmore appeared in the doorway. His face was ashen. Your Grace. Another letter. From France. Cassian's blood went cold. From Brennan? No, Your Grace. Whitmore's hands were shaking as he held out the envelope. From someone claiming to have information about your father's death. Information, they say, will change everything you think you know about your family. Cassian took the letter with numb fingers, broke the seal, read, and felt his entire world tilt sideways. Again. The letter was brief, precise, devastating. Your father didn't die of natural causes. He was poisoned, and I have proof. Meet me in London in 3 days if you want to know who killed him and why. Below that, a name Cassian didn't recognize. An address. A time. He read it 3 times, trying to process, trying to understand. His father. Poisoned. 20 years ago. The event that had shaped his entire life, the loss that had made him who he was. Murder. Someone had murdered his father, and whoever wrote this letter knew who and why. Cassian looked up at Whitmore. His voice came out strange. Hollow. Get Richard. Get Lyora. Now. Is everything all right, Your Grace? No. Cassian stared at the letter in his hands. Everything is not all right. Because if this is true, if my father was murdered, then everything I've believed about my family is a lie. And someone out there has been keeping that secret for 20 years. Whitmore paled. What are you going to do? Cassian stood, walked to the window, stared out at the estate his father had built, the legacy he'd inherited, the empire he'd dedicated his life to preserving, all of it potentially built on murder and lies. I'm going to find out the truth. His voice was ice and iron. Whatever it takes, wherever it leads. I'm going to find out who killed my father. And then I'm going to make them pay. The ruthless Duke was back. Not the isolated, controlled version who'd pushed everyone away, but something more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. A man who'd learned that love could coexist with vengeance, that vulnerability could sharpen rage instead of dulling it. A man who was about to discover that the greatest betrayal hadn't come from an ambitious peer or a greedy solicitor. It had come from inside his own family, and that discovery was about to tear apart everything he'd just rebuilt. The letter burned in Cassian's hands like a live coal. Not literally, but the weight of it felt physical, heavy, dangerous. The kind of knowledge that changed everything or destroyed you in the finding. Lyora stood across from him in the study, one hand protectively on her stomach, her face pale. Richard sat by the fire, the letter already read, his expression carved from stone. This could be a hoax, Richard said finally. Someone trying to exploit you while you're vulnerable. Playing on your grief. Cassian shook his head. The details are too specific. The date. The circumstances. Things that weren't public knowledge. Then it's someone who was there. Someone who's been sitting on this information for 20 years. The question is, why come forward now? Because I won. Cassian stared at the flames. Because I survived Pemberton and Brennan. Because I'm no longer the damaged 12-year-old boy who could be controlled or manipulated. Whoever sent this thinks I'm finally strong enough to hear the truth. Or they're trying to destroy you in a different way. Lyora moved closer. Cassian, your father's death shaped your entire life. If you go digging into this and find something that changes your understanding of who he was, of who your mother was, it could break you. Or it could free me. The words hung in the air. Cassian looked at his wife, really looked at her, saw the fear there, the protective instinct. She was thinking about their child, about the life they were building, about all the progress they'd made. And she was terrified he was about to sacrifice it all on the altar of the past. Here's what most people don't understand about truth. They think of it as this noble, pure thing, something worth pursuing at any cost, the foundation of justice and morality and all that philosophical nonsense. But truth is actually brutal, merciless. It doesn't care about your feelings or your carefully constructed worldview or the lies you've been telling yourself to survive. Truth just is. And sometimes, knowing it destroys you more thoroughly than any lie ever could. Cassian had spent 20 years believing a specific story about his parents, his father as the perfect duke, his mother as the tragic widow who couldn't survive without him, their love as the cautionary tale that taught him to fear connection. What if all of it was wrong? What if the foundation of his entire identity was built on murder and deception? I have to know, he said quietly. Whatever the cost. I have to know what really happened, even if it destroys you? Lyora's voice cracked. Even then, she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Then I'm coming with you. No. Yes, her voice was steel. You don't get to do this alone. You don't get to go chase ghosts from your past and potentially fall apart without me there to catch you. We're partners, remember? We face things together. You're pregnant. Which is exactly why I need to be there. Because if you find something that breaks you, if you discover truths you can't handle alone, our child deserves a father who survives it. And you'll only survive it if I'm there. Richard stood up. She's right. You're not doing this alone. Cassian looked between them. These two people who'd become his family, who'd stood by him through everything, who were now volunteering to walk into whatever nightmare awaited in London. The old Cassian would have refused, would have insisted on bearing the burden alone, would have seen their support as weakness. The new Cassian recognized it for what it was. Love. The kind that didn't run when things got dark. The kind that stayed and held your hand while you walked through hell. All right, he said finally, together. They left for London the next morning. The journey was silent, heavy with anticipation and dread. Cassian stared out the window, watching the countryside blur past, and tried to prepare himself for whatever waited at the end. But how do you prepare to have your entire understanding of your life rewritten? The address from the letter led to a modest townhouse in a respectable but unremarkable neighborhood, not the kind of place Cassian usually frequented. Too middle class, too anonymous, perfect for hiding secrets. They arrived exactly on time. Cassian knocked on the door with Richard and Leora flanking him like sentries. A woman answered, old, 70s maybe, with eyes that had seen too much and carried the weight quietly. "Your Grace." She curtsied, the gesture automatic. "I've been expecting you. You sent the letter." "I did. Please, come in." The interior was clean but sparse. Minimal furniture. No personal touches, like someone had been living here temporarily for 20 years. The woman led them to a small sitting room, gestured for them to sit. Cassian remained standing. "Who are you?" The woman settled into a worn chair. "My name is Margaret Fenwick. I was your father's personal secretary for 15 years. I was with him the day he died." Cassian felt ice slide down his spine. "You were there. I was there. I watched him collapse, watched the physicians fail to save him, and I watched your mother destroy herself with grief afterward." She paused. "But I also watched something else, something I've kept silent about for 2 decades. "What?" "I watched his brother poison him." The room went absolutely still. Cassian's uncle, Edward Vale, Edward. The man who'd served as regent until Cassian came of age, who'd managed the estates, who'd been nothing but supportive and helpful, and who would have inherited everything if Cassian had failed. "You're lying," Cassian heard himself say. "Edward wouldn't he?" Margaret's expression was sad. "Your uncle spent his entire life in your father's shadow. Second son, second choice, second everything. Your father was charming and brilliant and everyone's favorite. Edward was competent but overlooked. Do you have any idea what that does to a man? So he killed him? Out of jealousy? Out of desperation. Your father was planning to cut him off, to remove him from estate management. They'd had a massive fight about Edward's gambling debts. Your father threatened to expose him publicly unless he got help. Edward couldn't bear the humiliation. Prove it." Margaret stood slowly, walked to a cabinet, pulled out a box, set it on the table between them. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Correspondence between Edward and various unsavory characters. Discussions of poison. Payments to a chemist who specialized in substances that mimicked natural death. Plans. Timelines. Evidence. Cassian picked up one of the letters. His hands were shaking. The handwriting was unmistakably his uncle's. "Why didn't you come forward 20 years ago?" "Because Edward threatened me. Told me if I said anything, he'd destroy my family. And I believed him, so I took these letters and I hid. I've been hiding ever since, and now I'm dying." Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact. "Cancer. 6 months if I'm lucky. And I decided I didn't want to die with this secret. Your father deserved better, and so did you." Leora spoke for the first time. "Where is Edward now?" Margaret looked at Cassian. "You don't know?" "Know what?" "He's at Ravenhold. Has been for the past 3 weeks. Showed up claiming he wanted to reconcile. To spend time with you and your new wife." The ice in Cassian's veins turned to fire. Edward was at Ravenhold. Right now. In his home. Near Leora. Near the estate. Near everything. And he was a murderer. Cassian turned toward the door. Richard grabbed his arm. "Wait. Think this through. There's nothing to think through. That bastard killed my father, and I'm going to—" "What?" Richard's voice was sharp. "Kill him? Become exactly what you've spent the past year trying to move away from? He murdered my father." "I know, and he'll pay for it. But through proper channels. With evidence. With justice. Not with you throwing away everything you've built for revenge." Cassian wanted to argue. Wanted to rage. Wanted to ride back to Ravenhold and tear Edward apart with his bare hands. But Leora's hand found his, squeezed, and the fury didn't disappear. But it focused, sharpened into something colder and more effective than rage. Strategy. "How long has he been sick?" Cassian asked Margaret. Who? Edward. You said you're dying. I'm asking about him. Margaret blinked. I don't know what you mean. Cassian moved closer. You've been hiding for 20 years, living in this anonymous townhouse, waiting. And suddenly, you decide to come forward now. Not because you're dying, because he is. Margaret's expression shifted, confirmed what Cassian had already guessed. He's dying. And he's scared. Scared of facing judgment, scared of what comes after. So he came to you, trying to make amends, trying to confess. And you decided to give him a different kind of punishment. You're quite perceptive, Your Grace. I'm my father's son. Cassian took the box of letters. And I'm going to make sure Edward pays for what he did. Not with my hands, with the truth. Olchant. They rode back to Ravenhold through the night. Cassian's mind was racing, planning. Edward had killed his father and walked free for 20 years. Had served as regent. Had helped shape Cassian's childhood. Had been there for every major moment. All of it a lie. All of it built on murder. The rage was enormous, overwhelming. But underneath it was something else. Grief. For the father he'd lost. For the childhood that had been stolen. For the 20 years he'd believed a false narrative. And guilt. Because he'd spent his entire adult life emulating his father, trying to be worthy of the legacy. And all of it had been based on a man who'd been murdered by his own brother. You're quiet, Leora said. Thinking. About how my entire life has been shaped by a lie. About how I turned myself into an emotional fortress because I thought my father's death proved love was weakness. But it didn't prove that at all. It proved that evil exists, that betrayal comes from unexpected places, that the people closest to you can destroy you. Does knowing that change anything? Cassian was quiet for a long moment. Everything. Nothing. I don't know yet. When they arrived at Ravenhold, it was nearly dawn. The castle loomed against the lightening sky, ancient and imposing and full of secrets. Whitmore met them at the entrance. His face was tight with worry. Your Grace, your uncle has been asking for you. He seems agitated. I'm sure he is. Cassian handed off his coat. Where is he? In the East Wing, your old nursery. Actually, he asked to see it. The nursery, where Cassian had spent his childhood, where his father used to read to him before bed, where everything had been innocent and safe, before Edward had poisoned that safety along with his brother. Take me to him. Your Grace, perhaps you should rest first. Now, Whitmore. They climbed the stairs in silence. Richard and Leora followed close behind. When they reached the nursery door, Cassian paused. This was it. The confrontation. The moment where he faced the man who'd shaped his life through murder and deception. Pushed open the door. Edward stood by the window. Old now. 75 at least. Thin and frail in expensive clothes that hung loose on his frame. He turned when he heard them enter. And Cassian saw the truth immediately. Margaret had been right. Edward was dying. It was written in every line of his face, every labored breath. Nephew. Edward's voice was a rasp. You came. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped. Edward moved away from the window, slowly, painfully. I have things to tell you, confessions to make. I know what you did. The words stopped Edward cold. Cassian pulled out the box of letters, set it on the small table that had once held his childhood toys. Margaret Fenwick sends her regards. Edward's face went white. She's alive? Very much so, and very forthcoming about what happened 20 years ago. The old man sank into a chair. So you know that you murdered my father? Yes. That you poisoned him and let everyone believe it was natural? Yes. That you spent 20 years lying to my face while helping yourself to the estate you stole? Yes. Edward, I know everything. Edward closed his eyes. Good. That's good. Good? Cassian's voice was ice. You murdered my father and you think it's good that I found out? Yes. Because I'm tired. So tired of carrying this. And I wanted you to know the truth before I died. How noble. Don't. Edward's eyes opened, blazing with something that might have been pain or might have been defiance. Don't pretend you're better than me, boy. You've spent your entire adult life being just as ruthless as I was, destroying anyone who stood in your way, using people and discarding them. The only difference between us is I had the courage to go all the way. The courage? Cassian moved closer. You call murdering your own brother courage? I call it survival. Edward struggled to his feet. Your father was going to destroy me, expose my debts, ruin my reputation, leave me with nothing. So yes, I poisoned him, and I'd do it again. Even knowing it destroyed his wife, his son? Your mother was weak. She would have been destroyed anyway. And you? Edward laughed bitterly. You turned out stronger than your father ever was. So maybe I did you a favor. A favor. The word hung in the air like poison. Cassian felt the rage building. The desire to hurt this man, to make him suffer the way he'd made an entire family suffer. And then Leora's hand touched his back. Light, grounding, reminding him who he was now, who he'd chosen to become. You're going to prison, Cassian said quietly. I'm giving all this evidence to the Crown. You'll spend whatever time you have left in a cell, alone, with nothing but your guilt for company. I'm dying anyway, prison or palace. What's the difference? The difference is everyone will know what you did. Your name will be dragged through every scandal sheet in England. Your legacy will be murder and betrayal. And when you die, you'll die knowing that despite everything, despite murdering my father and trying to steal everything he built, you failed. Because I survived. I thrived. And I'm building something better than you ever could have destroyed. Edward stared at him. Something shifted in his expression. Maybe regret. Maybe just exhaustion. You really have changed. The old you would have killed me where I stood. The old me didn't have anything worth losing. Cassian looked at Leora. Now I do. So I'm not going to let you turn me into a murderer too. You'll face justice, real justice, and I'll move on with my life knowing I was better than you. That's very noble. Edward's voice was fading. Very civilized. But tell me, nephew, doesn't part of you want to hurt me? To make me pay? Of course it does. I'd be inhuman if it didn't. But wanting something and doing it are different things. And I choose not to become what you are. Then you're a better man than your father was. Don't. Cassian's voice cracked. Don't you dare talk about him like you knew him, like you had the right. But I did know him. Better than you ever did. Edward sank back into the chair. He was brilliant and kind and deeply flawed. He had terrible judgment about money, even worse judgment about people. And he loved your mother so completely it made him vulnerable. That's what got him killed. Not my ambition, his weakness. Love isn't weakness, isn't it? Look what it did to your mother, to you, to everyone your father touched. His love destroyed them all. No. Leora spoke up. Her voice was firm, clear. His love sustained them, even in death, even through grief. Cassian's mother loved him so much she couldn't imagine life without him. That's not weakness. That's the kind of connection most people spend their entire lives searching for and never find. And it killed her. She killed herself. Because of you. Because you took away the person who made her life worth living. Don't blame love for what murder destroyed. Edward had no answer for that. They stood in the nursery as dawn light filtered through the windows. 4 people connected by blood and betrayal and the complicated truth of family. Finally, Cassian spoke. Richard, send for the authorities. Give them everything. The letters. Margaret's testimony. All of it. Richard nodded and left. Cassian turned back to Edward. You're going to tell me everything, every detail, every moment, every choice, and I'm going to listen, not because you deserve to confess, but because I deserve to understand. And if I refuse, then you die alone with your secrets, your choice. Edward looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, slowly, like a man accepting the inevitable. It started 3 years before he died. I'd made some bad investments, gambling debts. Your father found out. The confession took 6 hours. Edward talked until his voice gave out, until every detail had been spilled. The planning, the acquisition of the poison, the careful administration, the watching as his brother slowly weakened and died, and the aftermath. The guilt that never quite went away, the fear of discovery, the slow realization that he'd destroyed his own soul for an estate he'd never wanted, and a title that felt like chains. Cassian listened to all of it. Every word, every justification, every moment of weakness and cowardice. When Edward finally finished, they sat in silence. Outside, the authorities arrived. Richard showed them in. They arrested Edward without drama, read the charges, applied the restraints. The old man looked small in the official custody, broken, like the weight of 20 years was finally crushing him. As they led him away, he stopped in the doorway, looked back at Cassian. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that means nothing, but I am sorry. Cassian didn't respond, just watched as they took away the last living connection to his father, the man who'd murdered him, who'd shaped Cassian's entire life through violence and deception. When they were gone, Leora wrapped her arms around him. Are you all right? No, but I will be. How can you be sure? Because I have you, and that's enough. The trial was swift and brutal. Edward pleaded guilty to all charges, offered no defense, just sat in the dock looking old and tired while the prosecutor detailed his crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison, died 6 weeks later of the same cancer that had been eating him alive. Cassian attended the funeral, not to mourn, but to close the chapter, to stand over the grave and finally let go of the ghost that had haunted him for 20 years. There were no tears, no grand gestures, just a quiet acknowledgement that evil had existed in his family, that betrayal had shaped him, and that he was choosing to move forward anyway. Leora stood beside him, her hand in his, her presence the only thing keeping him grounded. When it was over, they walked away from the gravesite without looking back. That night, Cassian sat in his study staring at his father's portrait. The painting showed a man in his prime, confident, powerful, every inch the Duke. But now Cassian could see what he'd missed before. The kindness in the eyes, the slight smile that suggested humor, the hand extended in greeting rather than command. His father hadn't been perfect. Edward had been right about that. He'd been flawed and too trusting and made terrible financial decisions. But he'd also been loved by his wife, by his staff, by the people who'd known him as more than just a title, and that mattered more than perfection. I'm sorry, Cassian said to the portrait. Sorry I spent 20 years being afraid to be like you. Sorry I thought your love was weakness. Sorry I didn't understand until now that you gave me the greatest gift a father can give his son. What gift? Leora asked from the doorway. Cassian turned to look at her. The knowledge that love is worth the risk, that connection matters more than control, that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. He stood, walked to her, placed his hand on her stomach where their child grew. I'm not going to make his mistakes, but I'm also not going to run from his legacy. Our child is going to know love, real love, the messy, complicated, terrifying kind. And yes, it might hurt them sometimes, but it'll also make them strong in ways isolation never could. Leora's eyes filled with tears. You're going to be an amazing father. I hope so. Because I'm absolutely terrified. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. They stood together in the study, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of the future. And Cassian realized something profound. He'd spent his entire life trying to avoid becoming his mother, trying not to love so completely that losing it would destroy him. But he'd already failed at that. He loved Leora completely, totally, in the all-consuming way that would absolutely wreck him if he ever lost her. And that was okay, because the alternative was the emptiness he'd lived in for 30 years. The cold isolation that masqueraded as strength. The fortress that kept everyone out and trapped him inside. Better to love and risk loss than to never love at all. Better to be vulnerable and human than safe and alone. Better to be his father's son than the ruthless Duke who felt nothing. Take. 3 months later, Leora gave birth to a daughter. The labor was difficult, terrifying. Cassian spent 18 hours pacing the halls while physicians worked, and Leora screamed and his entire world hung in the balance. When they finally let him in, Leora was pale and exhausted and holding a tiny red-faced bundle that was somehow the most beautiful thing Cassian had ever seen. It's a girl, Leora said. Her voice was hoarse but triumphant. We have a daughter. Cassian approached slowly, like the child might shatter if he breathed too hard. Leora placed her in his arms, and he looked down at this tiny person who'd just entered the world. She had his eyes, Leora's nose, a shock of dark hair, and the most serious expression he'd ever seen on a baby. What should we name her? Cassian thought about his father, his mother, the legacy of pain and love that had brought him to this moment. Eleanor, after my mother. But we'll call her Ellie. It's perfect. He sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his daughter, still trying to process that this was real, that he was a father, that this fragile, perfect creature was his responsibility. I don't know how to do this, neither do I, but we'll figure it out together. What if I mess her up? What if I damage her the way my father damaged me? Leora reached up and touched his face. Your father didn't damage you. Life did. Betrayal did. But your father loved you. And that love is what saved you in the end. It's what brought you back to me. It's what made you capable of this. She gestured at the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. You're going to make mistakes. We both are. But as long as we love her and show up for her and do our best, she'll be okay. More than okay. Cassian looked at his daughter, at his wife, at the life they were building together from the ruins of everything that had come before. And for the first time in his entire existence, he felt something settle in his chest, something warm and solid and unshakable. Peace. Not the peace of isolation, not the false calm of emotional detachment, but real peace. The kind that comes from knowing who you are and accepting it completely. He was Cassian Vale, Duke of Ravenhold, husband to an extraordinary woman, father to this tiny miracle, and he was enough, exactly as he was, damaged and healing, flawed and trying, human in all the messy, complicated, beautiful ways that mattered. I love you, he said to Leora. I know. I'm going to tell you that every day for the rest of our lives. Good. I'll never get tired of hearing it. Ellie stirred in his arms, made a small sound. Cassian rocked her gently, instinctively, like some part of him already knew what to do. Welcome to the world, little one. Your parents are a mess. Your family history is complicated, and nothing about your life is going to be simple. But I promise you this. You will be loved, completely, unconditionally, the way every child deserves to be loved. He kissed her forehead, felt tears on his own cheeks. Leora was crying too, happy tears. The kind that came from joy so intense it had nowhere else to go. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. A new day, a new chapter, a new life beginning. And inside Ravenhold Keep, in a room where light finally penetrated the darkness, a ruthless duke learned the most important lesson of his life. Power isn't about control, it's about connection. Strength isn't about isolation, it's about being brave enough to let people in. And love isn't weakness, it's the only thing strong enough to save you. 5 years passed. Ellie grew into a wild, brilliant child who asked endless questions and climbed trees and had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Cassian discovered he was capable of playing tea party and reading bedtime stories and being gentle in ways he'd never imagined. The foundation he'd created with Leora flourished. They built schools and libraries and programs that gave opportunities to people who'd never had them. The tenants prospered. The staff thrived. Ravenhold transformed from a fortress into a community. And Cassian himself became someone new. Not completely different. He was still sharp in business negotiations, still commanded rooms with his presence, still made decisions with absolute certainty. But now he came home at night, ate dinner with his family, tucked his daughter into bed, made love to his wife like she was the only thing that mattered. Because she was. Society noticed the change. Some approved, some were scandalized. Most just adjusted their understanding of what it meant to be the Duke of Ravenhold. Richard and Catherine became permanent fixtures at the estate. Ellie adored her grandparents. Cassian discovered he enjoyed having family around. Margaret Fenwick died peacefully in her sleep 2 years after Edward's conviction. She left everything she had to a charity for abused women. Cassian made sure the charity received additional funding in perpetuity. The portrait of his father still hung in the study. But now Cassian looked at it with understanding instead of fear, with acceptance instead of the need to prove something. On Ellie's 5th birthday, Leora found Cassian standing in the garden, the same garden where they'd had their first real conversation about rebuilding their marriage. Thinking about anything important? Just how lucky I am. She moved to stand beside him, slipped her hand into his. We both are. I spent so many years being afraid of feeling, afraid of needing someone. Afraid that love would destroy me the way it destroyed my mother. And now I know the truth. Love did destroy me. The old me. The cold, controlled, isolated version. And thank God for that. Because what grew in its place is so much better. Leora leaned against him. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Never. I thought we were doomed from the start. Incompatible. Too broken to fix. What changed? I did. You did. We decided fixing was worth the effort. They stood together as the sun set over Ravenhold. Ellie's laughter drifted from somewhere in the castle. Staff moved about their duties. The estate hummed with life and activity and warmth. Everything Cassian had been so certain he didn't want. Everything that had saved him. Do you have any regrets? Leora asked. Cassian thought about the question seriously. About the years of coldness. The damage he'd done. The time he'd wasted. I regret hurting you. I regret those first 3 years when I was too afraid to be human. But I don't regret the journey. Because every mistake taught me something. Every failure made me stronger. And all of it led me here. To me. To you. To Ellie. To this life we've built. And I wouldn't trade any of it. Even the pain, especially the pain, because it taught me that I could survive it. That vulnerability doesn't destroy you. It refines you, makes you into something more than you were. When did you get so philosophical? When I finally stopped running and started paying attention. Ellie appeared around a hedge, her dress covered in dirt, a flower crown crooked on her head. Papa, come see the castle I built in the garden. Cassian smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face, made him look younger, lighter, free. Show me. He let his daughter drag him away toward her imaginary castle. Leora followed, laughing, and they spent the evening playing in the dirt, like the title and the fortune and the complicated history didn't matter at all. Because in that moment they didn't. All that mattered was the love, the connection, the family. The ruthless Duke had finally learned what true power looked like, and it looked like this. Messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. 10 years after that first confrontation in the garden, Cassian stood at the same fountain where Leora had once asked if he loved her. She was inside the house, helping Ellie get ready for her first formal ball. Their daughter was 15 now, brilliant and headstrong and so much like her mother it sometimes hurt to look at her. They'd had 2 more children since, a son named Thomas who had Leora's gentle nature, and another daughter, Catherine, who was pure chaos and joy. The estate prospered, the foundation grew. Cassian's reputation evolved from ruthless duke to respected leader to something approaching beloved patriarch. But he never forgot where he'd started, never took for granted the life he'd almost destroyed through fear and control. Every morning, he woke up next to Leora and reminded himself how close he'd come to losing everything. Every night, he tucked his children into bed and thanked whatever force in the universe had given him the chance to be better than he was. Richard found him by the fountain. The older man moved slower now, used a cane, but his mind was still sharp, hiding from the chaos, reflecting on the fact that 28 years ago, I married the love of my life and spent the first 3 years treating her like a stranger. And somehow, miraculously, she gave me another chance. She saw something in you worth saving. I'm still not sure what. Richard laughed. That's because you're too close to see it, but the rest of us can. You're a good man, Cassian. You weren't always, but you are now. I'm trying to be. That's all any of us can do. They stood together watching the sun set. 2 men who'd started as strangers and become family. What's the secret? Cassian asked suddenly. To a good life, to making it all mean something? Richard considered the question. Don't run from the hard things. Don't hide from pain. And when you find people who matter, hold on to them. Everything else is just details. Simple advice. The best advice usually is. Leora appeared in the doorway, beautiful in an evening gown, still taking his breath away after all these years. They're ready for you. Cassian offered his arm. She took it. They walked back toward the house together. Inside, their children were laughing. The ballroom was decorated. Guests were arriving. Life was happening in all its messy, complicated, wonderful glory. And Cassian Vale, once known as the Ruthless Duke, stood in the center of it all and felt something he'd never expected to feel. Complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. His family, his love, his life. All of it built on vulnerability and trust and the courage to keep trying even when every instinct screamed to run. The music started. Cassian danced with his wife, then with his daughters, then with Leora again because she was his favorite partner and always would be. Later, when the guests had gone and the children were asleep, they stood together on the balcony overlooking the gardens. Happy? Leora asked. Beyond measure. Any regrets? Only that it took me so long to figure out what mattered. But you figured it out eventually. That's what counts. Cassian pulled her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt her heartbeat against his chest. I love you. More than I thought possible. More than I can ever adequately express. I know. She smiled against his shoulder. And I love you too. Even when you're being impossible. Even when you retreat into old patterns. Even when you drive me absolutely crazy. Especially then. Especially then. They stood together under the stars. Two people who'd been broken and had somehow found a way to heal each other. And Cassian realized that this was the real ending. Not the dramatic confrontation or the courtroom victory or even the truth about his father. This quiet moment of peace, this love that had survived everything, this life they'd built together from ruins and refusal to give up. This was what winning actually looked like. Not dominance, not control, not the ruthless accumulation of power, but connection, partnership. The courage to be vulnerable and the strength to keep choosing love even when it was terrifying. Cassian had spent his entire life afraid of becoming his parents, afraid their story would repeat itself. And in a way, it had. He'd found a love so complete that losing it would destroy him, just like his father had loved his mother. The difference was he wasn't afraid anymore, because he'd learned the truth his father had known all along. Some things are worth the risk, worth the fear, worth the possibility of devastation. Love was one of them. And standing there with Leora in his arms, and his children sleeping peacefully inside, and the future stretching out ahead of them full of promise and uncertainty in life, Cassian finally understood what his father had tried to teach him. The greatest power in the world isn't the power to control others. It's the power to let yourself be loved. And that power had saved him, transformed him, made him human. The ruthless Duke was gone. In his place stood simply a man, flawed, trying, learning, and finally, beautifully, completely alive. The end? This is where the story concludes. Not with thunder or conquest, but with the quiet triumph of a man who learned that strength isn't about domination. It's about the courage to be vulnerable. The ruthless Duke became something far more powerful than he ever imagined. He became someone capable of love, of partnership, of building a legacy not in stone and gold, but in the hearts of the people who matter. Cassian and Leora's story is a reminder that we all carry damage. We all have walls built from pain, but those walls don't have to be permanent. With the right person, with enough courage, with the willingness to risk everything, we can tear them down. We can build something better. We can become who we were always meant to be. Not perfect, but human. And that's more than enough.